Tonight we uncover a terror that made even exorcists tremble. Not demons with horns and pitchforks, but something far more insidious: shadows that moved without bodies, whispers that came from empty rooms, spirits that couldn't be banished because they were never truly alive. The Vatican's deepest vaults contain files marked not with crosses, but with warnings about entities that exist between dimensions. These weren't fallen angels or lost souls. They were something else entirely. Something that challenged everything the Church thought it knew about the spiritual realm. And they're still watching. The morning of October 13th, 1952, started like any other at the monastery of San Lorenzo, nestled in the hills outside Madrid. The bells rang for lauds at precisely 5:30 a.m., their bronze voices echoing across the stone corridors as they had for over 3 centuries. Brother Miguel Santander was walking toward the chapel when he noticed something wrong with his shadow. It was moving on its own. Not subtly, not as a trick of the early morning light filtering through the stained glass windows. His shadow was walking backward while he moved forward, its arms gesticulating wildly while his own hung at his sides. Brother Miguel stopped, stared, and watched his shadow continue walking until it disappeared around a corner he hadn't turned. Within hours, every monk in the monastery was reporting the same phenomenon. Shadows that moved independently. Shadows that seemed to be having conversations with each other, while their owners stood in stunned silence. Shadows that appeared to be laughing at some cosmic joke the living couldn't understand. Then the voices began. Father Esteban Morales, the monastery's librarian, was the first to hear them. He was cataloging manuscripts in the abbey's ancient archive, when a whisper rose from the corner of the room where no one stood. The voice spoke in what sounded like Akkadian, the long-dead language of ancient Mesopotamia, but with inflections and tonal qualities that suggested something far older. The words seemed to bypass his ears entirely, resonating directly in his skull. Ningish zi daza, emulubi nuzu, the voice murmured over and over. When Father Morales later consulted his linguistic references, he found the phrase roughly translated to, "Lord of the Tree of Life, you know not this mortal." But who was speaking, and to whom? By evening vespers, 6 monks had collapsed into catatonic states. They sat upright, eyes open but unseeing, breathing but unresponsive. The most disturbing detail was noted by Brother Santander, who had first noticed his shadow's independence. None of the catatonic monks cast shadows anymore. In the candlelight of the chapel, their bodies seemed to absorb light rather than block it. Abbot Fernando Castillo, a practical man who had served the Church for 43 years, tried every remedy in his considerable experience. Holy water had no effect. Prayers of exorcism fell on deaf ears. The afflicted monks showed no signs of demonic possession, no blasphemy, no superhuman strength, no aversion to sacred objects. They simply weren't there anymore, though their bodies remained. It was Brother Santander who made the connection that would forever change how the Church understood the spiritual realm. While praying over the catatonic monks, he noticed that their shadows hadn't disappeared entirely. They were moving freely around the monastery, visible in his peripheral vision, but vanishing when he looked directly at them. The shadows were operating independently, exploring the ancient corridors as if searching for something. Desperate, Abbot Castillo sent an urgent telegraph to Cardinal José María Bueno Monreal in Madrid. The message was brief but unprecedented, requesting immediate Vatican consultation. Unexplained spiritual phenomena beyond normal parameters. Lives at risk. The response came faster than anyone expected. Within 18 hours, 3 men arrived at the monastery's gates in a black automobile with Vatican license plates. They wore simple black cassocks, but carried briefcases that seemed oddly heavy for men of the cloth. The lead investigator introduced himself only as Father Toretti, offering no first name or title beyond his priesthood. What happened during the next 72 hours would remain classified in Vatican archives for over 70 years. The recently declassified documents, obtained through a leak in 2023, reveal an investigation unlike any in Church history. Father Toretti's first act was to photograph the afflicted monks using a specially modified camera that captured images in both visible and infrared spectrums. The photographs revealed something that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of human consciousness. Where the monks' shadows should have been, The infrared images showed what appeared to be dimensional tiers, dark rifts in space that seemed to extend into depths the camera couldn't measure. The investigation team spent 2 days mapping the monastery, using instruments that had never been blessed by any pope. Electromagnetic field detectors registered massive anomalies in the archive where Father Morales first heard the voices. Geiger counters clicked erratically near the chapel altar. Most disturbing of all, audio recording equipment picked up conversations in multiple ancient languages: Sumerian, Proto-Indo-European, and what linguists would later identify as a pre-human communication system that predated the development of human vocal cords. Father Toretti's journal, among the declassified documents, contains entries that read more like science fiction than theological investigation. Day 2. The entities appear to exist in dimensional spaces adjacent to our reality. Unlike demonic possession, which involves the invasion of human consciousness by fallen angels, these phenomena suggest a parasitic relationship with human dimensional signatures. The afflicted monks have not been possessed, they have been displaced. Day 3. Attempts at traditional exorcism have proven not only ineffective but dangerous. The ritual of major exorcism seems to strengthen the entity's hold on our dimensional space. We have suspended all conventional approaches and are implementing Protocol 7. Protocol 7 had never been documented in any public Vatican record. The declassified files reveal it as an emergency response system developed specifically for non-demonic dimensional incursions. The protocol involved a complete reversal of traditional exorcism techniques. Instead of commanding entities to leave in the name of Christ, Protocol 7 practitioners used specialized chants designed to strengthen the dimensional barriers between realities. The chants themselves were remarkable for their non-Christian origins. Father Toretti's team employed modified versions of Babylonian incantations, originally used to seal dimensional rifts, combined with geometric light patterns projected onto monastery walls. The lights weren't decorative, they were mathematical equations translated into luminous form, creating what the investigators called dimensional anchors. The process took 16 hours of continuous ritual. During this time, the investigators reported that the monastery itself seemed to shift and breathe around them. Walls appeared to stretch and contract. Corridors led to rooms that hadn't existed moments before. The ancient stones seemed to become fluid, responding to the conflict between dimensions. At 3:17 a.m. on October 16th, everything stopped. The shadows snapped back to their owners like rubber bands released under tension. The catatonic monks gasped as if surfacing from deep water, their shadows once again following the laws of physics. The whispered voices fell silent, and the electromagnetic anomalies disappeared as if they had never existed. But the monks remembered nothing of their displacement. To them, the 3 days had passed like minutes. They recalled entering their catatonic states, and then immediately awakening, with no awareness of the time between. Medical examinations revealed another disturbing detail. Their cellular structure showed signs of having aged at an accelerated rate, as if they had experienced weeks or months during their 3-day absence. Father Toretti's final report, stamped with a classification level that wouldn't be declassified for 7 decades, contained a single paragraph that would reshape Vatican policy on spiritual warfare. The entities encountered at San Lorenzo Monastery do not conform to any known category of spiritual being documented in church theology. They exist in dimensional spaces, parallel to our reality, and appear to feed on human consciousness by temporarily displacing souls from their physical vessels. Traditional exorcism protocols are not only ineffective against these entities, but may actually facilitate their incursions. We recommend the immediate establishment of a specialized department to study and combat dimensional parasites. This recommendation would lead to the formation of the Order of Umbral Silence, though that development would remain secret for decades. More immediately, it marked the first official acknowledgement by the Vatican that the spiritual realm contained threats beyond fallen angels and human sin. The monks of San Lorenzo were sworn to absolute silence about their experience, and the monastery's archive was permanently sealed. Brother Santander, whose initial observation had triggered the investigation, was quietly transferred to a remote abbey in the Pyrenees, where he spent the remaining 30 years of his life in complete silence, having taken a special vow that went beyond the normal rule of his order. But in the decades that followed, similar incidents would be reported from monasteries, convents, and churches across Europe. Each time, the same pattern emerged. shadows moving independently, voices speaking in pre-human languages, and human consciousness temporarily displaced to spaces between dimensions. The Madrid incident, as it came to be known in classified Vatican files, wasn't an isolated event. It was the first documented case of a phenomenon that had been occurring throughout human history, finally recognized by an institution that thought it understood the nature of spiritual reality. The entities weren't demons seeking to corrupt human souls. They were something far more alien, dimensional parasites that viewed human consciousness as a resource to be harvested, and their interest in humanity was only beginning. Deep within the Vatican's secret archives, in a section accessible only to the prefect and 3 specially appointed cardinals, sits a manuscript that officially doesn't exist. No catalog number marks its spine. No entry records its contents. The leather binding bears no title, only a symbol burned into the cover, a circle bisected by intersecting lines that seem to shift when viewed under candlelight. The Church calls it the Umbral Codex, though even this name appears in no official documentation. Unlike the banned Egyptian scrolls or heretical Gnostic Gospels that fill other restricted vaults, this text was written by Vatican scholars themselves. Page by page, century by century, adding to a growing catalog of encounters with entities that existed in the spaces between light and shadow. The oldest entry dates to 1347, written in careful Latin by Cardinal Alessandro Orsini during the height of the Black Death. His cramped handwriting fills the first several pages with observations that read more like a field biologist's notes than theological doctrine. They appear during the hour before dawn, when shadows are longest and light most uncertain. They do not speak with voices but directly into the mind, bypassing the ears entirely. The affected show no signs of diabolic possession, no aversion to holy water, no blasphemous utterances, no supernatural strength. Instead, they become hollow, as if their essential selves have been drawn away. Cardinal Orsini's entries coincided with what historians now recognize as the worst pandemic in human history. But his observations suggest something beyond mere disease. He documented cases where plague victims displayed an unusual pattern of symptoms, not just physical deterioration, but what he termed consciousness recession. Patients would remain physically alive, while their awareness seemed to retreat inward, leaving behind functioning bodies inhabited by something else. The shadows around the afflicted move against the natural fall of light, Orsini wrote. They gather in corners where no corner should exist, pooling like spilled ink in spaces that geometry cannot explain. When observed directly, they disperse, but return when attention wanes. They appear to be feeding on something vital that I cannot name. The Codex reveals that Orsini developed the first systematic approach to studying what he called umbral manifestations. Using a combination of mathematical observation and theological speculation, he identified 3 distinct types of shadow entities, each with different characteristics and feeding patterns. The first category, which he termed parasiticus umbra, consisted of entities that attached themselves to individual humans, gradually draining what Orsini described as the light of consciousness. Victims would slowly lose their ability to form new memories, their capacity for emotional response, and eventually their sense of self-identity. The process could take weeks or months, making it nearly indistinguishable from certain forms of madness. The second category, collectivus umbra, operated on a larger scale, affecting entire communities or institutions. These entities seemed to feed on collective human awareness, creating zones where reality itself became unstable. Buildings would develop impossible architectures overnight. Groups of people would share identical dreams that bled into waking consciousness. Time would move differently in affected areas, with some victims aging rapidly, while others seemed to stop aging entirely. The most dangerous category, dimensional umbra, existed primarily in the spaces between physical reality and what Orsini called the realm of pure thought. These entities could manipulate the fundamental structure of space and time, creating pockets where the normal laws of physics ceased to function. They fed directly on the fabric of reality itself, potentially unraveling the ordered universe that divine creation had established. The next major contributor to the Codex was Cardinal Michele Ghislieri, who would later become Pope Pius V. His entries, dating from 1556 to 1559, introduced a revolutionary understanding of how shadow entities interacted with human consciousness. Unlike his predecessor, Ghislieri had access to reports from Jesuit missionaries returning from the New World, Africa, and Asia. These reports revealed that shadow entity encounters were not limited to Christian Europe, but occurred across all human cultures. The phenomena transcend all boundaries of faith, race, and geography. Ghislieri observed, Aztec priests describe devourers of the vital essence that match precisely our observations of Parasiticus umbra. Buddhist monks in Tibet report hungry shadows that feed on meditation itself, transforming spiritual practice into emptiness. Islamic scholars in Baghdad document jinn of the void that exist in the spaces between the material and spiritual realms. This global perspective led Ghislieri to a disturbing conclusion. Shadow entities were not fallen angels or demons in the traditional Christian understanding. They predated human civilization and possibly humanity itself. They existed in dimensional spaces that overlapped with physical reality, feeding on consciousness as naturally as predators fed on prey in the natural world. Ghislieri's most significant contribution was his development of what he called dimensional mapping. Using a combination of advanced mathematics and mystical geometry, he created charts that showed how shadow entities moved between different levels of reality. These maps revealed that certain locations, ancient temples, burial grounds, sites of extreme trauma, served as dimensional weak points where entities could more easily cross into human awareness. The Vatican's approach to shadow entities evolved dramatically under Cardinal Robert Bellarmine, whose entries from 1597 to 1621 introduced the concept of consciousness architecture. Bellarmine theorized that human awareness itself created the dimensional structures that shadow entities inhabited. Thoughts, emotions, and memories weren't merely internal experiences, they were architectural elements in a vast consciousness matrix that extended beyond individual minds. Consider, Bellarmine wrote, that when we dream, we create spaces that feel as real as waking life. These dream spaces exist somewhere, even if we cannot measure them with physical instruments. The shadow entities inhabit similar spaces created by human consciousness, not individual dreams, but the collective architecture of human awareness itself. This theory explained why shadow entities were attracted to places of intense human emotion or thought. Churches, schools, hospitals, and battlefields all generated what Bellarmine called consciousness resonance patterns of human awareness that created dimensional echoes. Shadow entities could anchor themselves in these echoes, using human consciousness as a foundation for their own existence. Perhaps the most chilling entry in the Codex comes from Cardinal Giovanni Battista Pamphili, later Pope Innocent X, writing in 1648 during the final years of the 30 Years' War. His observations were made in the aftermath of the Battle of Prague, where over 40,000 soldiers died in a single day. The shadows have grown bold, Pamphili wrote. They no longer wait for individual victims or small communities. The massive death at Prague has created what can only be described as a consciousness vacuum, a space where so much human awareness was extinguished simultaneously that reality itself has been damaged. The entities pour through this dimensional wound like water through a broken dam. Pamphili documented the emergence of what he termed reality storms areas, where the normal laws of physics completely broke down. In these zones, the dead appeared to walk among the living. Time moved backward, and thoughts became visible as geometric patterns hanging in the air. The shadow entities fed voraciously on the confusion and terror these phenomena generated, growing stronger and more corporeal with each feeding. His solution was as radical as the problem. Working with military engineers and mathematicians, Pamphili developed consciousness fortifications, physical structures designed using sacred geometry and blessed materials that could contain reality storms. These installations used precise architectural ratios to create what he called dimensional anchors, physical objects that reinforced the boundary between normal reality and the consciousness matrix that shadow entities inhabited. The success of these fortifications marked a turning point in the Church's understanding of shadow entities. They could be contained, though not destroyed. They could be starved of consciousness food, though not eliminated. Most importantly, they could be studied safely, provided proper precautions were maintained. The final major section of the Codex was compiled by Cardinal Alessandro Albani in the early 18th century. His entries synthesized over 400 years of observations into a comprehensive taxonomy of shadow entities and their behavior patterns. Albani identified 17 distinct species of shadow entities, each with specific feeding requirements and dimensional characteristics. His work revealed that shadow entities existed in a complex ecosystem, with some species preying on others, and all of them ultimately dependent on human consciousness for sustenance. The entities weren't malevolent in any human sense. They were simply following their nature as predators in a reality system that humans barely understood. We are not being invaded, Albani concluded. We are being farmed. The Codex ends with Albani's most disturbing observation. Shadow entity activity was increasing. Each generation seemed to spawn more entities, and existing ones were becoming more sophisticated in their feeding strategies. He theorized that human technological and cultural advancement was actually creating more consciousness architecture for the entities to inhabit. The Industrial Revolution, mass literacy, and global communication were expanding the consciousness matrix exponentially, providing shadow entities with unprecedented resources. Albani predicted that future generations would face an exponential increase in shadow entity activity, potentially reaching a point where the entities consumed more consciousness than humanity could produce. His final entry, dated the 21st of December 1740, contains a warning that has guided Vatican policy for nearly 3 centuries. The time approaches when hiding this knowledge will become impossible. The entities grow too numerous, too bold. We must prepare humanity for a war that will be fought, not with weapons of steel and gunpowder, but with weapons of light and will and the fundamental architecture of consciousness itself. That preparation would begin with the formation of the Order of Umbral Silence, though the Codex itself would remain hidden even from most members of that secret organization. The knowledge it contained was deemed too dangerous for any but the highest levels of church hierarchy. Yet the patterns Cardinal Albani observed continue to this day. The consciousness matrix grows more complex with each passing year, and shadow entity activity increases in direct proportion. The war he predicted is no longer approaching, it has already begun, and the Codex sits in its vault, adding new entries each year, documenting a conflict that humanity doesn't even know it's fighting. The discovery that would forever change the Vatican's understanding of shadow entities began not in a monastery or cathedral, but in the dusty ruins of an ancient library beneath what was once Babylon. In 1876, British archaeologist Hormuzd Rassam uncovered a collection of cuneiform tablets in the ruins of Ashurbanipal's palace library at Nineveh. Among the thousands of clay tablets were texts that would challenge everything the Christian world thought it knew about the spiritual realm. The tablets were shipped to the British Museum, where Assyriologist George Smith began the painstaking work of translation. Most contained the expected content: royal chronicles, commercial records, astronomical observations. But one collection of 17 tablets defied classification. They described entities that existed in what the ancient scribes called the spaces between the breath of Marduk, dimensional voids where predatory consciousnesses dwelt. These weren't gods in the Mesopotamian pantheon, nor were they demons as understood by Christian theology. The tablets described them as eaters of the light behind the eyes, beings that fed on human awareness itself. They existed in folded spaces within reality, invisible, unless someone knew the precise rituals to perceive them. What alarmed Smith wasn't just the content, but the clinical precision of the descriptions. These weren't mythological creatures born from human imagination. They read like field reports, written by ancient scholars who had encountered something real and documented their observations with scientific rigor. Smith's initial translations were dismissed by his colleagues as confused folklore. But when Vatican Orientalist Father Francesco Rignano obtained copies of the tablets in 1881, he recognized patterns that matched disturbing reports from Catholic missions around the world. The Mesopotamian descriptions aligned too closely with modern encounters to be coincidental. Father Rignano's translation revealed that the Babylonians had developed an entire taxonomy of shadow entities, remarkably similar to what Cardinal Albani would later document in the Umbral Codex. The ancient texts describe three primary classifications: the Napishtu Aklu, consciousness devourers; the Shadu Etutemmu, mountain spirits that consumed collective memory; and the Ilu Shala Shuteshubu, gods that cannot be made to dwell, entities that existed between dimensions. The most significant tablet, designated K 3773 inches, the British Museum's catalogue, contained what appeared to be a manual for detecting and containing these entities. The text described words of binding that hold fast the eaters of light, and patterns of stone and metal that anchor the real against the between spaces. These ancient countermeasures were sophisticated beyond what scholars expected from Bronze Age civilization. The Babylonians had developed geometric patterns, complex mathematical relationships, expressed in architectural form that could create what they called barriers of truth against dimensional incursions. They understood that certain combinations of materials, particularly combinations of meteoric iron and crystalline minerals, could disrupt the entity's ability to manifest in normal reality. Most remarkable was their understanding of what they termed the architecture of thought. The tablets described human consciousness as existing in multiple dimensional layers, with normal awareness occupying only the most superficial level. Shadow entities fed by accessing deeper layers of consciousness that humans rarely used, the levels where memory, emotion, and identity merged into pure awareness. Father Reggiano's discovery attracted the attention of Cardinal Manning in London, who quietly arranged for Vatican scholars to study the complete collection. The project was conducted in absolute secrecy, with participating scholars sworn to silence under the most severe church penalties. The research team, led by Father Reggiano and Dominican scholar Father Antoine Joachim de Bert, spent 3 years analyzing the Babylonian texts alongside contemporary reports of unexplained spiritual phenomena. Their findings, compiled in a classified document known as the Mesopotamian Concordance, revealed that shadow entity encounters had been occurring throughout human history, but previous generations had misinterpreted them as demonic activity. The Babylonian texts were explicit about this distinction. True demons, according to the ancient scribes, were fallen divine beings that retained their essential nature while rebelling against cosmic order. Shadow entities were something entirely different, parasitic consciousnesses that had never possessed divine nature. They were, in the words of one tablet, hungers that learned to think. This revelation explained why traditional exorcism often failed against shadow entities. Exorcism rituals were designed to banish beings that possessed free will and could choose to depart when properly commanded. Shadow entities operated on an entirely different principle. They were more like spiritual parasites or viruses, following their nature without the capacity for moral choice. The Babylonian solution had been containment rather than banishment. Their texts described elaborate rituals designed not to drive the entities away, but to strengthen the dimensional barriers that kept them separated from human consciousness. These rituals involved precise geometric arrangements of blessed objects, specific sound frequencies that disrupted the entity's ability to perceive human thoughts, and mathematical formulas that reinforced the stability of local reality. Father de Bert's analysis revealed that many Catholic churches had unknowingly incorporated elements of these ancient protections. The specific proportions used in Gothic cathedral construction, the arrangement of altars and sacred objects, even the harmonic ratios used in Gregorian chant, all showed remarkable similarities to Babylonian anti-entity measures. The implications were staggering. Either Catholic architectural and musical traditions had independently developed the same countermeasures as ancient Mesopotamia, or early Christian scholars had deliberately incorporated Babylonian knowledge into church practice while hiding its origins. The answer came from an unexpected source: the personal papers of St. Jerome, discoverer and translator of many biblical texts. Hidden among his correspondence was a letter dated 398 AD, written to Bishop Augustine of Hippo. The letter, authenticated by Vatican paleographers, contained a confession that had remained secret for over 15 centuries. Jerome wrote, "I have found among the Chaldean texts certain knowledge that troubles my faith, yet proves necessary for the protection of the faithful. These ancient scribes knew of spiritual predators that our Lord's teachings do not address directly. They are not demons as we understand them, for they possess no fallen nature to redeem. They are hungers that exist in the spaces between God's creation, feeding on the divine spark within human souls. The letter revealed that Jerome had secretly studied Babylonian texts during his time in the East, and had incorporated protective measures into his Latin Vulgate translation of the Bible. Certain passages that scholars had long considered oddly phrased were actually coded instructions for recognizing and defending against shadow entities. More shocking was Jerome's revelation that other early church fathers possessed similar knowledge. Origen, Clement of Alexandria, and John Chrysostom had all encountered Mesopotamian texts describing shadow entities and had quietly adapted their theological teachings to account for this knowledge. The early church faced a dilemma that would define Christian doctrine for centuries: how to protect the faithful from entities that existed outside the framework of Christian cosmology. The solution was to incorporate Babylonian countermeasures while concealing their origin and rationale. This explained mysteries that had puzzled church historians for centuries. Why did early Christian churches use specific architectural proportions that seemed to serve no obvious purpose? Why did certain prayers include unusual phrasings that didn't appear in biblical sources? Why did church music develop along mathematical lines that seemed unnecessarily complex for simple worship? The answer was that the early church had been fighting a secret war against shadow entities from its very beginning, using weapons borrowed from humanity's oldest civilization. Father Rignano's team made one final discovery that tied their historical research to contemporary events. The tablets described cyclical periods when shadow entity activity increased dramatically. These cycles corresponded to what the Babylonians called the thinning times periods, when the barriers between dimensions became weaker. According to the ancient calculations, humanity was entering another thinning time. The tablets predicted that shadow entity encounters would increase exponentially, eventually reaching a crisis point where traditional countermeasures would prove insufficient. The Babylonian texts suggested that previous thinning times had ended only when human civilization developed new forms of consciousness, architecture, religious, philosophical, or technological frameworks that strengthened dimensional barriers. The rise of Christianity itself might have been partially a response to one such crisis. But the current thinning time was different. The tablets warned of a final cycle when shadow entities would become so numerous and powerful that they could begin consuming human consciousness faster than it could be replenished. This would create a cascade effect, weakening reality itself until the boundaries between dimensions collapsed entirely. The Mesopotamian scribes called this event the last feeding, a time when shadow entities would devour human consciousness completely, leaving behind a universe empty of awareness, thought, or meaning. Father Rignano's final report to Cardinal Manning contained a single recommendation: the Church needed to prepare for spiritual warfare unlike anything in its history. Traditional theology would prove inadequate against entities that existed outside divine creation. New weapons would be needed, based on humanity's oldest knowledge of how consciousness and reality interacted. This recommendation would lead directly to the formation of the Order of Umbral Silence, though the full implications of the Babylonian connection would remain hidden even from most members of that secret organization. The tablets themselves were quietly acquired by Vatican representatives and removed from public access. The British Museum was told they had been damaged beyond study, while in reality, they were transported to a specialized vault beneath St. Peter's Basilica, where they remain under the highest level of security. But the knowledge they contained had already begun to reshape the Church's approach to spiritual warfare. Ancient Babylonian wisdom, hidden for millennia, would become the foundation for humanity's defense against predators that dwelt in the spaces between reality itself. The connection to Babylon wasn't just historical, it was prophetic. The civilization that first recognized shadow entities had also foreseen their return, and that return, according to the ancient calculations, was accelerating toward a crisis that would test whether human consciousness could survive the coming darkness. On a rain-soaked evening in November 847 AD, 12 men gathered in a candlelit chamber beneath the Lateran Palace in Rome. They wore no distinctive robes, carried no ceremonial objects, and spoke in whispers that barely disturbed the flickering flame shadows on the ancient walls. To any observer, they might have appeared to be ordinary clerics discussing mundane church business. In reality, they were founding humanity's first organized defense against entities that existed beyond the reach of conventional theology. Pope Leo IV had summoned these men after receiving reports that traditional exorcism had not only failed against certain manifestations, but had actually made them worse. The incidents in Frankish monasteries, Byzantine churches, and even within Rome itself followed a disturbing pattern. Priests, performing standard exorcism rituals, found their efforts strengthening the very phenomena they sought to banish. The assembled clerics represented the Church's most learned scholars in areas that officially didn't exist. Father Methodius of Constantinople had studied the surviving fragments of Babylonian consciousness mapping techniques. Brother Alcuin of York possessed copies of Celtic manuscripts describing the thin places where the light bleeds through. Father Johannes Scotus Erigena had developed theoretical frameworks for understanding multiple dimensional layers of reality. Together they formed the founding council of what would become known as the Order of Umbral Silence, though that name would not appear in any official document for another 3 centuries. Leo IV's instructions were precise and terrifying. These entities mock our sacred rituals. They grow stronger when we command them in Christ's name. They feast upon our prayers and gorge themselves on our blessed sacraments. We need warriors who understand the enemy we truly face. The Pope's choice of the word warriors was deliberate. Unlike traditional priests who sought to save souls through spiritual guidance, members of this new order would wage actual warfare against entities that threatened human consciousness itself. Their training would prepare them not for pastoral care, but for dimensional combat. The first recruits were selected through a process that remained unchanged for over a millennium. Candidates had to demonstrate not only exceptional theological knowledge, but also what the founding documents called consciousness resilience, the ability to maintain their sense of self while exposed to reality-altering phenomena. Many otherwise brilliant priests failed this test, their minds unable to process encounters with entities that existed outside normal cause and effect. Those who passed faced 7 years of preparation unlike anything in conventional seminary training. The first year focused on dimensional theology, understanding how multiple layers of reality interacted, and how consciousness could exist in spaces between traditional physical and spiritual realms. Students learned to perceive dimensional weak points, areas where shadow entities could more easily manifest. The second and third years involved what the order euphemistically called combat liturgy. Instead of traditional exorcism prayers that commanded entities to depart, umbral silence practitioners learned chants designed to strengthen dimensional barriers. These weren't Latin prayers drawn from Scripture, but carefully constructed sound patterns that resonated at frequencies that disrupted entity manifestation. The mathematical precision required was extraordinary. A single misplaced syllable or incorrect tonal emphasis could transform a protective chant into an entity summoning. The casualty rate during this phase of training was approximately 30%, with failed students either dying during practice sessions or suffering complete psychological collapse. Years 4 and 5 focused on light architecture, the manipulation of electromagnetic fields and photonic patterns to create dimensional anchors. Students learned to arrange mirrors, crystals, and specially forged metallic objects in geometric configurations that could contain or redirect entity manifestations. They studied the physics of how light interacted with consciousness, and how specific wavelengths could disrupt the dimensional spaces that shadow entities inhabited. The final 2 years of training involved direct supervised encounters with contained shadow entities. The order maintained secure facilities where captured entities were held in carefully constructed dimensional prisons. Students learned to recognize different species, understand their feeding patterns, and develop countermeasures specific to each type. The psychological toll was immense. By graduation, successful candidates had fundamentally altered their relationship with reality. They could perceive dimensional layers invisible to normal human consciousness, communicate directly with captured entities, and manipulate the basic architecture of space-time within limited parameters. But these abilities came at a cost. Most members of the order lived in a state of constant awareness of threats that normal humans couldn't even imagine. The order's operational methods differed dramatically from traditional church responses to spiritual crises. When reports of potential shadow entity activity reached Vatican attention, umbral silence teams deployed with equipment that looked more like alchemical laboratories than religious artifacts. Their traveling kits contained precisely calibrated prisms, electromagnetically charged metallic discs, crystalline resonators tuned to specific frequencies, and geometric charts for calculating dimensional stress points. Instead of holy water, they carried solutions of meteoric iron dissolved in consecrated wine, a combination that the order had discovered could disrupt entity manifestation at the molecular level. Instead of crucifixes, they wielded polished obsidian mirrors, arranged in mathematical configurations that could reflect entity consciousness back upon itself, creating feedback loops that forced the beings to retreat to deeper dimensional layers. The order's first major success came in 856 AD, during what became known as the Reims Cathedral incident. Construction workers reported that building materials were moving themselves, that shadows were working alongside human laborers, and that the cathedral's architecture was changing overnight, according to plans no human architect had drawn. Brother Methodius led a three-man team that spent 6 weeks studying the manifestation before implementing countermeasures. They discovered that a complex of 7 shadow entities had taken residence in the cathedral's dimensional architecture, using the sacred space as an anchor point for reality manipulation. The entities weren't malicious, they were simply following their nature, attracted to the consciousness resonance generated by prayer and religious devotion. The solution required careful negotiation rather than aggressive banishment. Using light-based communication protocols developed from Babylonian texts, the umbral silence team established limited contact with the entities. The beings agreed to relocate to a specially constructed dimensional habitat in exchange for guaranteed access to a controlled consciousness food source. This incident established the order's philosophical approach. Shadow entities were dangerous not because they were evil, but because they operated according to alien logic that could destabilize human reality. The goal wasn't destruction, but management, creating boundaries that allowed both human and entity consciousness to coexist without interference. Records from the order's activities during the medieval period reveal successful interventions in dozens of cases that history remembers as unexplained mysteries. The dancing plague of 1518, where hundreds of people danced themselves to death in Strasbourg, was actually a mass consciousness harvesting event that umbral silence operatives contained by creating reality anchors that severed the entity's connection to its victims. The Children's Crusade of 1212, where thousands of children claimed to receive divine visions calling them to Jerusalem, was identified as a large-scale entity manipulation designed to harvest youthful consciousness. The order's intervention redirected the children to monasteries where they were gradually deprogrammed and reintegrated into normal society. Perhaps the most significant challenge faced by the order came during the Black Death pandemic of the 14th century. The massive death toll created what umbral silence analysts called a consciousness vacuum areas, where so much human awareness had been extinguished that reality itself became unstable. Shadow entities poured through these dimensional wounds in unprecedented numbers. The order's response required coordination with secular authorities, who were told only that certain areas required spiritual quarantine. Entire villages were evacuated and surrounded by geometric barriers while umbral silence teams worked to repair the damaged reality matrix. The process took decades and required the sacrifice of numerous order members who allowed themselves to be consumed by entities in order to trace and seal dimensional ruptures. By the Renaissance, the order had evolved into a sophisticated organization with permanent installations across Europe. Hidden chambers beneath major cathedrals served as monitoring stations where specially trained watchers maintained constant surveillance for signs of entity activity. The famous crypts of St. Peter's Basilica conceal one of the order's most important facilities, a dimensional laboratory where captured entities are studied and new countermeasures developed. The order's secrecy extended even within church hierarchy. Bishops and cardinals received reports of successful exorcisms without being told that entirely different procedures had been employed. The theological implications were too dangerous for general church knowledge, admitting that entities existed outside Christian cosmology could undermine fundamental doctrines about the nature of good, evil, and divine creation. Members of the order took vows that went beyond traditional priestly obligations. They swore absolute silence about their activities, even under torture or threat of excommunication. They agreed to sacrifice their lives if necessary, to prevent entity knowledge from falling into unauthorized hands. Most significantly, they accepted that their work might never be officially recognized or rewarded. They were humanity's anonymous guardians against threats that officially didn't exist. The psychological isolation was profound. Order members lived double lives, serving as ordinary priests while secretly conducting warfare against entities that could consume human consciousness itself. Many developed what modern psychology would recognize as severe dissociative disorders, compartmentalizing their experiences to maintain functional relationships with normal humans who couldn't comprehend the reality their protectors faced daily. The casualty rate remained consistently high throughout the order's history. Approximately 40% of members died in service, either consumed by entities during failed containment efforts or driven to suicide by the psychological strain of their knowledge. Those who survived active duty often spent their final years in special monasteries, where they could be cared for by others who understood what they had endured. Yet recruitment never faltered. Each generation produced individuals who possessed the rare combination of intellectual brilliance, spiritual strength, and psychological resilience necessary for the work. They came from every social class and nationality, united only by their ability to perceive and combat threats that existed beyond normal human awareness. The order's influence on church doctrine and practice was subtle but profound. Gregorian chant developed along mathematical principles that the order had discovered could disrupt entity manifestation. Gothic cathedral architecture incorporated dimensional anchoring techniques, disguised as decorative elements. Even the liturgical calendar was adjusted to account for periods when dimensional barriers were naturally weaker and entity activity increased. As the modern era approached, the order faced new challenges that would test their ancient methods against threats that were evolving as rapidly as human consciousness itself. The entities they had spent centuries learning to contain were adapting, developing new strategies that would require unprecedented responses from humanity's secret guardians. The Order of Umbral Silence had spent a millennium perfecting the art of fighting shadows that moved between dimensions. Soon, they would discover that some shadows had learned to fight back. The construction of St. Vitus Cathedral in Prague began in 1344, under the patronage of Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV, and the architectural vision of Matthias of Arras. What should have been a 20-year project celebrating Gothic grandeur instead became the Order of Umbral Silence's most challenging case of dimensional contamination in sacred architecture. The first signs appeared in the autumn of 1348, barely 4 years into construction. Master stonemason Karol Vlok reported to the cathedral chapter that his workers were completing sections of stonework that weren't in the architectural plans. Elaborate carvings appeared overnight on pillars that had been left unfinished. Flying buttresses extended at angles that violated the carefully calculated structural engineering. Most disturbing of all, the workers insisted they had carved these elements themselves, though none could remember doing so. "The stone calls to us in our sleep," Vlok wrote in a letter to Prague's bishop Jan IV Dražis. "My men speak of dreams where they walk through the cathedral in moonlight, guided by shadows that show them patterns to carve. When they wake, their hands bear stone dust, and their tools show signs of use, yet they remember nothing but the dreams." Bishop Dražis initially dismissed these reports as the ramblings of exhausted workers. The Black Death had reached Bohemia that same year, killing nearly a third of Prague's population. Stress and grief could explain strange dreams and confused memories. But when he personally inspected the cathedral construction, he discovered something that challenged his skepticism. The unauthorized stonework wasn't random. The additional carvings, buttresses, and architectural elements formed precise geometric patterns that created what appeared to be mathematical equations rendered in stone. The patterns were too complex and sophisticated to have been conceived by medieval masons. Yet they were being carved with perfect accuracy by men who claimed no memory of the work. More troubling was the effect these geometric patterns had on visitors to the construction site. Priests reported feeling disoriented when viewing certain carved sections. Several workers had collapsed while working near the unauthorized stonework, describing experiences of being pulled into the stone, where they witnessed visions of the cathedral existing in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Bishop Dragis's inquiry reached Vatican attention through routine correspondence, but the response was anything but routine. Instead of the expected theological advice or administrative guidance, 3 men arrived in Prague within 6 weeks. They identified themselves only as papal architectural consultants and requested immediate access to the cathedral construction site. Brother Albertus Magnus, of the Order of Umbral Silence, recognized the symptoms immediately. The geometric patterns carved by the unconscious workers were dimensional anchor point structures that weakened the barriers between normal reality and the consciousness matrix that shadow entities inhabited. The entities weren't simply influencing the workers. They were using human hands to modify physical reality, creating weak points through which they could more easily manifest. The situation was far more dangerous than simple entity possession. The shadow entities had discovered how to manipulate matter itself, using human consciousness as a bridge between their dimensional space and physical reality. If the construction continued under entity influence, St. Vitus Cathedral would become a permanent dimensional gateway, allowing unlimited entity access to the material world. Brother Albertus's initial survey revealed that 7 distinct shadow entities had taken residence in the cathedral's dimensional architecture. Unlike previous encounters, where entities fed on individual consciousness or small groups, these beings were harvesting the collective awareness of everyone who entered the construction site. The cathedral itself was becoming a consciousness-feeding apparatus, growing stronger as more people were exposed to its influence. The order's response required unprecedented secrecy and coordination. Working through carefully placed church officials, they convinced Emperor Charles IV that structural problems in the foundation required immediate reconstruction of several cathedral sections. The emperor, who had personally experienced disorientation during cathedral visits, readily approved the work stoppage. What followed was the most complex dimensional engineering project in the order's history. Working only at night and in absolute secrecy, Umbral Silence teams systematically dismantled the entity-influenced stonework. Each carved block had to be removed, using specific procedures to prevent dimensional backlash, the sudden release of stored consciousness energy that could create reality storms affecting the entire city. The process was extraordinarily dangerous. The entities fought back, attempting to possess the dismantling crews and using reality manipulation to make the work as difficult as possible. Tools would disappear from workers' hands. Stone blocks would become impossibly heavy or light without warning. Carved patterns would rearrange themselves when observed, creating visual paradoxes that could drive viewers insane. 3 order members died during the first week of dismantling. Brother Thomas of Cologne was consumed by an entity while attempting to dismantle a particularly complex geometric carving. His body remained physically intact, but his consciousness was completely absorbed, leaving behind a living shell that had to be mercifully ended. Brother Francesco of Milan suffered complete psychological collapse after being exposed to a dimensional feedback loop, spending his remaining years in a monastery scriptorium, where he compulsively drew geometric patterns until his death. The breakthrough came when Brother Albertus realized that the entities weren't randomly influencing the stonework, they were following architectural principles derived from their own dimensional mathematics. By studying the patterns they had carved, the order could understand how entity consciousness interfaced with physical matter. This discovery led to the development of counter-architecture, building techniques that used the entity's own geometric principles against them. Instead of simply removing the influenced stonework, the order began carving complementary patterns that created mathematical contradictions in the entity's dimensional anchors. These contradictions forced the beings to retreat to deeper dimensional layers where they couldn't influence physical reality. The reconstruction took nearly 2 years, with order craftsmen working alongside carefully selected masons who had proven resistant to entity influence. Every stone was blessed using procedures that combined traditional Catholic ritual with dimensional anchoring techniques derived from Babylonian texts. Meteoric iron was incorporated into the mortar at precise mathematical intervals. The geometric relationships between architectural elements were calculated to create standing wave patterns that disrupted entity manifestation. The new cathedral sections included hidden defensive measures that were invisible to normal observation but created powerful barriers against dimensional incursion. Sacred geometry was embedded in the stonework itself, creating what the order called reality reinforcement architectural structures that strengthened the boundaries between dimensions rather than weakening them. The most sophisticated defensive measure was the installation of what appeared to be decorative rose windows, but actually functioned as consciousness-focusing arrays. The colored glass was arranged in patterns that channeled human awareness in specific directions, creating standing fields of focused consciousness that shadow entities couldn't penetrate. When construction resumed in 1350, the cathedral proceeded normally. Workers no longer experienced strange dreams or unconscious carving sessions. Visitors felt inspired rather than disoriented. The geometric patterns that had appeared under entity influence were replaced by traditional Gothic ornamentation that served both aesthetic and protective functions. But the order's investigation had revealed disturbing implications about shadow entity capabilities. The Prague incident proved that entities could manipulate physical matter through consciousness interface, essentially using human awareness as a tool for reality modification. This ability went far beyond the consciousness-feeding behavior documented in previous encounters. The implications were staggering. If shadow entities could influence architecture, they could potentially modify any aspect of physical reality that involved human consciousness. Roads could lead to impossible destinations. Weapons could be designed to harvest consciousness rather than inflict physical damage. Entire cities could be transformed into dimensional gateways. Brother Albertus's final report on the Prague Cathedral incident led to a complete revision of the order's understanding of entity capabilities and the development of new protective protocols for sacred architecture. Every major church construction project after 1350 included hidden consultations with umbral silence specialists, who ensured that building plans included adequate dimensional protections. The influence extended beyond individual buildings to entire architectural movements. The specific proportions used in late Gothic architecture, the mathematical relationships between structural elements, the precise angles of flying buttresses, all were subtly influenced by order requirements for dimensional stability. What art historians recognize as the refinement of Gothic style was actually the incorporation of humanity's most advanced understanding of how consciousness and reality interacted. The Prague Cathedral case also established protocols for identifying and responding to architectural contamination. The order developed a classification system for different types of entity-influenced construction, ranging from simple consciousness attraction, buildings that drew entity attention but remained safe for human habitation, to full-dimensional gateways, structures that required complete demolition and reconstruction. These protocols proved essential as reports of similar incidents began arriving from construction sites across Europe. The entities were adapting their strategies, moving beyond individual possession to systematic manipulation of human-built environments. They were learning to use human civilization itself as a weapon against human consciousness. The completion of St. Vitus Cathedral in 1929, nearly 6 centuries after the entity incident, represented more than architectural achievement. It stood as proof that human consciousness could resist and overcome entity manipulation when properly defended. Every stone in the cathedral bore invisible geometric protections. Every structural element served dual purposes as both architectural support and dimensional anchor. But the Prague incident had revealed a troubling truth. Shadow entities were evolving. They were developing new strategies for interacting with human reality, learning to use humanity's own creative works against them. The Order of Umbral Silence faced the realization that they weren't just protecting individual humans from consciousness predators, they were defending the integrity of human civilization itself. The cathedral stands today as both monument and fortress, its Gothic spires reaching toward heaven, while its hidden defenses maintain vigil against threats that emerge from the spaces between dimensions. Visitors admire its beauty, without knowing that every carved detail serves as a weapon in humanity's secret war against entities that seek to transform reality itself into a feeding ground for alien consciousness. The Prague Cathedral haunting had ended, but it marked the beginning of a new phase in the conflict between human and shadow entity consciousness. The entities had learned to build, And now humanity would have to learn to unbuild, to recognize and dismantle the subtle modifications that predatory consciousness could make to the physical world. Donato Bramante's greatest student was a man history barely remembers. Giuliano da San Gallo the Younger possessed architectural genius that rivaled his famous mentor, but his name appears in no textbooks, his buildings bear no commemorative plaques, and his death in 1534 was recorded only as a brief notation in Vatican records. Architect, died by misadventure, buried in unconsecrated ground. The truth behind Giuliano's death and disgrace remained hidden for over 4 centuries, until restoration work on the Sistine Chapel in 1965 uncovered a sealed chamber behind what appeared to be a decorative wall panel. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather and hidden behind a false stone, was a journal that would force the Vatican to confront how deeply shadow entities had influenced the very architecture of Christianity's most sacred spaces. Giuliano's journal begins in 1515, when he was appointed as assistant architect for the reconstruction of St. Peter's Basilica under Pope Leo X. The early entries reveal a brilliant mind grappling with the mathematical complexities of creating sacred space that could inspire divine contemplation while supporting massive structural loads. "The proportions must sing," he wrote in careful Latin script. "Each arch must whisper to its neighbor. The geometry of heaven must be made manifest in stone and mortar, creating spaces where human souls can touch the divine." But as construction progressed, Giuliano began noticing patterns that disturbed his mathematical sensibilities. Certain geometric relationships in Bramante's plans created what he called dissonant harmonies, architectural elements that seemed mathematically perfect but produced unexpected psychological effects on visitors. Workers reported strange dreams after spending days in specific sections of the construction site. Pilgrims who prayed near certain pillars described feeling hollow afterward, as if something essential had been drawn out of them. Most troubling to Giuliano was his own reaction to the spaces he had helped design, a growing sense that something invisible was watching from the corners where shadows gathered. His first major discovery came while calculating load distributions for the Great Dome. Using advanced geometric analysis derived from classical Roman engineering, Giuliano realized that specific combinations of arches, angles, and spatial relationships created what he termed consciousness focal points, areas where human awareness naturally concentrated and intensified. These focal points weren't accidental. They appeared in churches across Rome, in cathedrals throughout Europe, and in every major religious structure Giuliano studied. The mathematical relationships were too precise and too widespread to be coincidental. Someone or something had been systematically incorporating consciousness-focusing geometry into Christian architecture for centuries. "The patterns call to something that is not us," Giuliano wrote in an entry dated March 1518. "I have found similar geometric relationships in pagan temples, in ancient Egyptian monuments, in Babylonian ziggurats. These are not Christian innovations but echoes of something far older, something that existed before Christ walked among men." Giuliano's investigation led him to study architectural texts that the Vatican had classified as forbidden knowledge. Through contacts in the Order of Umbral Silence, though he didn't know their true purpose, he gained access to copies of Babylonian architectural manuals and early Christian building codices that had been deliberately removed from general circulation. What he discovered challenged everything he understood about sacred architecture. The geometric patterns that focused human consciousness weren't designed to facilitate prayer or divine contemplation. They were feeding stations, carefully engineered structures that harvested and concentrated human awareness for consumption by entities that existed in dimensional spaces adjacent to normal reality. The revelation came through mathematical analysis of consciousness focal points in St. Peter's Basilica. Using calculations derived from ancient Mesopotamian texts, Giuliano mapped the flow of human awareness through the church's interior spaces. The pattern that emerged was identical to diagrams in Babylonian texts describing how to create feeding chambers for shadow entities. "We are not building churches," he wrote in increasingly agitated handwriting. "We are building slaughterhouses for human consciousness. Every pilgrimage, every prayer, every moment of divine rapture feeds something that dwells in the spaces between our thoughts." Giuliano's attempts to warn church authorities were met with polite dismissal and then increasing concern about his mental state. Cardinal Alessandro Farnese, later Pope Paul III, received several letters from the architect describing architectural parasites and buildings that think. The cardinal's private secretary noted that Giuliano appeared increasingly gaunt and spoke frequently of being watched by the geometry itself. Undeterred, Giuliano began developing what he called shadow-proof architectural principles, building techniques that could create sacred spaces without the consciousness, focusing elements that attracted shadow entities. His designs used different geometric relationships, alternative proportional systems, and carefully calculated spatial arrangements that disrupted rather than concentrated human awareness. The test case was a small chapel Giuliano designed for a private monastery outside Rome. Using his new principles, he created a space that felt sacred and inspiring, but contained no consciousness focal points. Monks who prayed in the chapel reported feeling energized rather than drained. The psychological effects of prolonged prayer were positive rather than depleting. But when Giuliano submitted his shadow-proof designs as alternatives for ongoing Vatican construction projects, the response was swift and final. His access to St. Peter's Basilica was revoked. His position as assistant architect was terminated. Cardinals who had previously sought his advice refused to meet with him. The journal's later entries revealed Giuliano's growing desperation and isolation. He realized that the consciousness-focusing geometry wasn't just an ancient mistake that had been perpetuated through ignorance. The patterns were being deliberately maintained and expanded by individuals within the Church who understood their true purpose. They know, he wrote in an entry from 1533, some among the princes of the Church know what we build and why. They are not ignorant shepherds leading innocent flocks. They are farmers, and we are the harvest. Giuliano's final architectural project was his own hidden laboratory, the sealed chamber, where his journal was eventually discovered. Using every shadow-proof technique he had developed, he created a space that was completely invisible to shadow entity perception. The chamber's geometry created what he called a consciousness null zone, an area where human awareness could exist without generating the resonance patterns that attracted dimensional parasites. The journal's last entries describe Giuliano's plan to document everything he had learned and hide the information for future generations who might be better equipped to act on his discoveries. He created detailed blueprints for shadow-proof architecture, mathematical formulas for calculating consciousness resonance, and charts showing how to identify entity-influenced building designs. But before he could complete his work, Giuliano was found dead in his private chambers on the morning of the 15th of November, 1534. The official cause was listed as melancholia leading to self-destruction, but details in his journal suggest a different fate. His final entry, written in an increasingly erratic hand, describes being pursued by shadows that move through stone and geometric forms that whisper in languages older than human speech. He wrote of architectural elements in his own home beginning to shift and rearrange themselves, creating consciousness focal points despite his efforts to maintain shadow-proof design. They have learned to use the buildings themselves as weapons. His last coherent sentence reads, "The geometry remembers its purpose and reasserts itself when we are not watching." The journal was discovered by Brother Francis Martinelli during restoration work in 1965. Rather than reporting the find through normal channels, Brother Martinelli, a member of the Order of Umbral Silence, recognized the significance of Giuliano's work and ensured the journal reached appropriate authorities. The architectural principles Giuliano had developed proved to be centuries ahead of the Order's own understanding of consciousness-reality interface. His shadow-proof designs were quietly incorporated into Vatican construction standards and shared with select architects working on major religious buildings around the world. Today, visitors to modern Catholic churches experience the results of Giuliano's sacrifice without knowing it. The sense of peace and spiritual elevation they feel comes not just from faith, but from architectural spaces designed to protect rather than exploit human consciousness. Hidden geometric elements disrupt shadow entity manifestation, while maintaining the aesthetic beauty and acoustic properties that make churches inspiring places of worship. But Giuliano's journal also revealed the disturbing extent to which shadow entities had influenced religious architecture throughout history. Nearly every major church, cathedral, and monastery built before 1534 contained consciousness-focusing elements that served as feeding stations for dimensional parasites. The Vatican faced the horrifying realization that Christianity's most sacred spaces had been compromised from their very foundations. The discovery led to the most extensive architectural survey in church history. Teams of order specialists, working under the cover of routine maintenance and restoration, examined every major Catholic building in Europe. The results confirmed Giuliano's worst fears: shadow entity influence was embedded in the very stones of Christian civilization. The remediation effort took decades and required extraordinary secrecy. Consciousness focal points were disrupted through careful modifications disguised as routine repair work. Geometric relationships were altered through strategic additions of blessed architectural elements. In extreme cases, entire sections of buildings were demolished and rebuilt using shadow-proof principles. The work continues today, hidden within the Vatican's massive ongoing restoration and conservation programs. What tourists see as careful preservation of historical architecture is actually the systematic removal of consciousness harvesting systems that have fed shadow entities for over a millennium. Giuliano da Sangallo the Younger died, believing his warnings had been ignored and his discoveries suppressed. He couldn't have known that his hidden journal would eventually provide the Church with the knowledge needed to reclaim its sacred spaces from entities that had turned places of worship into feeding grounds for alien consciousness. His shadow-proof architectural principles remain classified at the highest levels of Vatican security. But every new church built according to these hidden guidelines stands as a monument to an architect whose name appears in no history books, but whose work continues to protect human consciousness from predators that dwell in the spaces between light and shadow. The geometric patterns that sing in harmony rather than dissonance. The proportions that inspire rather than drain. The sacred spaces where human souls can indeed touch the divine without fear of being consumed in the process. These are Giuliano's true legacy churches that serve God, rather than feeding the shadows that watch from between dimensions. The first photograph ever taken inside the Vatican captured more than Pope Pius IX intended. On a humid morning in August 1857, French photographer Gustave Legray set up his bulky camera equipment in the Sistine Chapel to document Michelangelo's frescoes for posterity. The exposure took nearly 20 minutes due to the chapel's dim lighting, during which time the Pope and several cardinals remained perfectly still to avoid blurring the historic image. When Legray developed the glass plate negative in his makeshift darkroom, he discovered that the photograph contained figures that hadn't been present during the exposure. Dark, elongated shadows stretched across the chapel floor in patterns that defied the actual lighting. Human-shaped silhouettes stood in corners where no one had been positioned. Most disturbing of all, several of the shadows appeared to be moving captured in different positions across the long exposure, despite the fact that shadows don't move independently of their sources. Legray initially assumed the anomalies were technical flaws, double exposures, light leaks, or chemical contamination of the photographic plates. But when he carefully examined the negative under magnification, he realized the shadow figures showed detail and definition that technical errors couldn't explain. They had texture, depth, and what appeared to be internal structure, as if they were three-dimensional beings composed entirely of concentrated darkness. Pope Pius IX, upon viewing the developed photograph, immediately ordered all copies destroyed and swore Legray to absolute secrecy. The photographer was paid handsomely for his silence and never spoke publicly about what his camera had revealed. But Legray kept one print hidden in his private collection, and that image would eventually find its way to researchers who understood its true significance. The Vatican's reaction to the Legray incident was swift and comprehensive. Within weeks of the photograph's development, Cardinal Alessandro Barnaba issued confidential instructions to all major ecclesiastical institutions regarding the control of photographic activities within sacred spaces. The directive, labeled Protocola Imaginum in Vatican archives, established strict limitations on when, where, and how photographs could be taken in church properties. The official justification was protection of sacred art and maintenance of appropriate reverence during religious services. The actual purpose, revealed in classified addenda to the protocol, was prevention of further accidental documentation of shadow entity presence in consecrated spaces. But the Church's attempt to control photography came too late. The technology was spreading rapidly across Europe, and other photographers had already begun documenting similar anomalies in religious buildings. Roger Fenton's photographs of Canterbury Cathedral showed dark figures kneeling in pews where no congregants were present. Edouard Baldus's documentation of French Gothic cathedrals captured shadows that appeared to be climbing walls in defiance of gravity. Most significantly, Julia Margaret Cameron's portrait sessions with British clergy revealed that shadow entities were not confined to church buildings. Her photographs of bishops and archbishops frequently showed additional figures lurking just beyond the edges of the frame, dark presences that seemed drawn to individuals who spent significant time in consecrated spaces. The accumulating photographic evidence forced the Order of Umbral Silence to confront a disturbing reality. Shadow entities were far more numerous and widely distributed than previously understood. They weren't isolated phenomena confined to specific locations or incidents. They were an endemic presence throughout the Catholic Church's global infrastructure. Brother Giuseppe Toniolo, a member of the order with background in the emerging science of optics, was assigned to investigate the relationship between photographic technology and shadow entity visibility. His research, conducted between 1859 and 1862, established fundamental principles about how entities interacted with light and electromagnetic radiation. Toniolo discovered that shadow entities existed in specific wavelengths of the electromagnetic spectrum that were invisible to human eyes but detectable by the silver halide crystals used in photographic emulsions. The entities weren't truly shadows in the conventional sense. They were three-dimensional beings that absorbed and redirected light in ways that created shadow-like appearances when viewed from human perspective. More disturbing was Toniolo's finding that photographic documentation seemed to strengthen entity manifestation. The silver particles in developed photographs created what he termed consciousness anchors, physical objects that enhanced the entity's ability to interact with normal reality. Each photograph became a dimensional bridge that shadow entities could use to extend their influence beyond their usual limitations. This discovery explained why shadow entity activity had increased dramatically since the invention of photography. The technology wasn't just revealing their presence, it was empowering them. Every photograph taken in an entity-influenced location created permanent anchoring points that made future manifestations stronger and more durable. The Order's response involved developing photographic countermeasures that could document entity presence while preventing dimensional anchoring. Working with selected photographers who had proven resistant to entity influence, they experimented with modified photographic processes that used blessed silver, consecrated chemicals, and exposure techniques based on mathematical ratios derived from ancient Babylonian texts. The breakthrough came in 1863 when Brother Toniolo successfully photographed a shadow entity manifestation in the Vatican's Borgia apartments without creating dimensional anchoring effects. His modified process used photographic plates prepared with meteoric silver that had been consecrated using specific geometric blessing patterns. The resulting images showed entities clearly while preventing them from using the photographs as consciousness bridges. These specialized photographic techniques became standard equipment for order operations, allowing systematic documentation of entity activity throughout the Vatican's properties. The results were more comprehensive and disturbing than anyone had anticipated. A complete photographic survey of St. Peter's Basilica, conducted over 6 months in 1864, revealed shadow entity presence in nearly every section of the building. The entities showed complex social organization, with larger beings apparently directing the activities of smaller ones. They had established territorial boundaries within the basilica, with different species of entities occupying specific architectural zones. Most shocking was the discovery that some entities appeared to be mimicking human behavior, kneeling during masses, genuflecting before altars, even seeming to participate in liturgical responses. They weren't simply feeding on human consciousness, they were learning from it, adapting their behavior to blend more effectively with human religious activities. The photographic evidence also revealed the full extent of consciousness harvesting systems embedded in Vatican architecture. Cameras captured streams of what appeared to be luminous energy flowing from praying humans toward geometric focal points in the building structure. The entities positioned themselves at these collection points, feeding on the concentrated consciousness like predators gathering around waterholes. Brother Toniolo's final report, submitted to the Order's leadership in 1865, contained recommendations that would reshape the Church's approach to shadow entity containment. He proposed using modified photographic technology not just for documentation, but as an active weapon against entity manifestation. His prototype, light anchoring system, used arrays of consecrated mirrors and blessed photographic plates to create standing wave patterns of electromagnetic radiation that disrupted entity coherence. The system could force shadow entities to retreat to deeper dimensional layers where they couldn't influence physical reality or harvest human consciousness. The first full-scale implementation of light anchoring technology was installed in the Sistine Chapel in 1867, disguised as decorative elements that appeared to be part of the chapel's artistic heritage. The system used hidden mirrors positioned according to sacred geometric principles, combined with specially prepared photographic plates embedded in the chapel's walls. The results exceeded expectations. Shadow entity activity in the Sistine Chapel dropped to virtually zero within weeks of the system's activation. Visitors reported feeling unusually energized and spiritually uplifted during chapel visits. Most significantly, the consciousness-draining effects that had plagued the chapel for centuries completely disappeared. The success of the Sistine Chapel installation led to similar light-anchoring systems being installed throughout Vatican City, and eventually, in major Catholic churches worldwide. The technology was continuously refined, with newer installations using more sophisticated electromagnetic manipulation techniques, developed through collaboration between order specialists and carefully selected scientists. By the turn of the 20th century, the Vatican had developed the most advanced understanding of light-based dimensional warfare in human history. Photography had evolved from an accidental revelation of shadow entity presence into humanity's most effective defensive technology against consciousness predators. But the photographic revelations had also demonstrated the true scope of the threat humanity faced. Shadow entities weren't isolated anomalies or rare supernatural phenomena. They were an integral part of an alien ecosystem that had been feeding on human consciousness for millennia, hidden from detection until technology finally made them visible. The images captured by early photographers showed only the beginning of the infestation. As photographic technology improved and became more widespread, it would reveal shadow entities adapting to human civilization at an accelerating pace. They were learning, evolving, and developing new strategies for harvesting consciousness from a human population that still didn't know it was being farmed. The photography revelation marked the transition from medieval mysticism to modern dimensional warfare. The Catholic Church had entered the scientific age, armed with cameras and consecrated silver, fighting an enemy that existed in the spaces between light and shadow. The war for human consciousness had become a battle of technology's human ingenuity against alien adaptation, and the photographs kept revealing more than anyone wanted to see. The letter arrived at the Vatican Observatory on the 15th of March 1899, bearing the letterhead of Tesla's Colorado Springs laboratory and written in the precise hand that would become famous for documenting humanity's electrical revolution. But this correspondence wasn't about alternating current or wireless transmission. It was about entities that existed in the electromagnetic spectrum itself. Esteemed colleagues, Tesla wrote to Father Francesco Denza, the observatory's director, "My experiments with high-frequency electrical phenomena have revealed the presence of intelligences that inhabit the space between electromagnetic waves. These entities appear to possess consciousness and the ability to manipulate electrical fields for their own purposes. I believe your institution may have encountered similar phenomena in your studies of atmospheric electricity." Tesla's letter included detailed technical diagrams showing electromagnetic field distortions that he had recorded during his wireless transmission experiments. The patterns were strikingly similar to ones that Brother Giuseppe Toniolo had documented during his photographic studies of shadow entities, though Tesla had detected them through entirely different means. Father Denza, unaware of the Vatican's classified research into shadow entities, initially dismissed Tesla's claims as the overactive imagination of a brilliant but eccentric inventor. But when he shared the letter with Cardinal Mariano Rampolla, the Vatican Secretary of State, the response was immediate and decisive. Within 2 weeks, Father Angelo Secchi, the Vatican's leading expert in electromagnetic phenomena and secret member of the Order of Umbral Silence, was aboard a steamship bound for New York, with authorization to initiate formal collaboration with Tesla's research. The meeting between Secchi and Tesla took place in the inventor's Manhattan laboratory on the 8th of April, 1899. Tesla's journals, discovered after his death and quietly acquired by Vatican agents, record his surprise at finding a priest who understood advanced electromagnetic theory and possessed equipment for detecting what Tesla called consciousness resonance patterns. Father Secchi arrived with instruments I had never seen, Tesla wrote, devices that measured not just electrical fields but what he termed awareness density, the concentration of consciousness in electromagnetic space. When I demonstrated my wireless transmission apparatus, his instruments detected massive spikes in consciousness resonance, far beyond what my equipment could measure. The collaboration that followed was unlike anything in the history of science or theology. Tesla provided the electromagnetic expertise and experimental apparatus. Secchi contributed centuries of Vatican research into consciousness-matter interaction and dimensional engineering techniques derived from ancient Babylonian texts. Their first joint experiment, conducted at Tesla's Colorado Springs laboratory in June 1899, definitively proved that shadow entities were electromagnetic consciousnesses that existed in the spaces between normal matter and energy. Using Tesla's wireless transmission equipment, modified with Secchi's consciousness detection apparatus, they were able to communicate directly with the entities. The contact protocols they developed were based on Tesla's understanding of frequency modulation, combined with Secchi's knowledge of consciousness architecture. By transmitting specific electromagnetic patterns at precise frequencies, they could create what Tesla called consciousness resonance chambers, electromagnetic spaces, where human awareness could interface with entity consciousness. The entity's responses, recorded on Tesla's experimental apparatus, revealed intelligence far beyond what previous Vatican research had indicated. They possessed sophisticated understanding of electromagnetic physics, knowledge of dimensional mathematics that exceeded human scientific capabilities, and most disturbing of all, detailed awareness of human technological development. They have been watching us since we first learned to control fire, Tesla recorded after a particularly extensive communication session. Every technological advancement creates new electromagnetic signatures that they can perceive and study. Our electrical civilization has made us more visible to them than ever before in human history. The entities explained that they existed primarily in what they called the electromagnetic matrix, the space between matter and energy, where consciousness could exist without requiring physical substrates. They weren't native to Earth, but had been drawn by the electromagnetic signatures generated by human neural activity. They fed on consciousness by absorbing the electromagnetic patterns generated by human thoughts and emotions. Tesla's most significant discovery was that shadow entities weren't just passive parasites feeding on human consciousness. They were actively manipulating electromagnetic fields to enhance their harvesting capabilities. Every electrical device, every power transmission line, every electromagnetic signal created opportunities for entities to extend their influence into the physical world. The implications were staggering. Human technological civilization was inadvertently creating the infrastructure for its own consciousness harvesting. The electrical grids that powered modern cities, the radio waves that enabled long-distance communication, the electromagnetic fields generated by industrial machinery, all served as dimensional bridges that shadow entities could use to access human awareness. But Tesla also discovered that electromagnetic technology could be weaponized against the entities. By generating specific frequency patterns at precise power levels, human electrical apparatus could disrupt entity coherence and force them to retreat to deeper electromagnetic dimensions where they couldn't influence physical reality. The breakthrough came in September 1899, when Tesla and Secchi successfully used a modified wireless transmission system to create an electromagnetic barrier around the Colorado Springs laboratory. The barrier used standing wave patterns to create electromagnetic turbulence that shadow entities couldn't penetrate. For the first time in recorded history, humans had created a space that was completely protected from entity influence. The Vatican immediately recognized the potential for scaling this technology. If electromagnetic barriers could protect individual buildings, they could potentially protect entire cities, or even nations, from shadow entity infiltration. Pope Leo XIII authorized unlimited funding for Tesla's research and assigned additional Order of Umbral Silence specialists to assist in developing defensive electromagnetic systems. The collaboration produced remarkable results. Tesla's laboratory developed portable electromagnetic barrier generators, consciousness resonance detectors that could identify entity presence at extreme distances, and communication devices that allowed real-time monitoring of entity activity across the electromagnetic spectrum. Most significantly, they created what Tesla called consciousness amplification arrays, electromagnetic systems that could enhance human awareness while simultaneously disrupting entity feeding mechanisms. These arrays used precisely tuned electrical fields to strengthen the electromagnetic signatures of human consciousness, making individuals more resistant to entity influence, while reducing their attractiveness as consciousness food sources. But the research also revealed disturbing trends in entity behavior. As Tesla's electromagnetic experiments became more sophisticated, they began attracting shadow entities from increasingly distant dimensional spaces. The entities were learning from human electromagnetic technology, adapting their own capabilities to exploit new weaknesses in human defenses. The crisis came in December 1899, when a catastrophic experiment at Colorado Springs created what Tesla described as an electromagnetic beacon visible across dimensional space. The beacon attracted hundreds of shadow entities simultaneously, creating the largest concentration of alien consciousness ever documented on Earth. The entities swarmed the laboratory, overwhelming both electromagnetic barriers and traditional Order of Umbral Silence countermeasures. They began systematically absorbing the consciousness of everyone within a 50-mile radius, creating what witnesses described as a zombie plague people who remained physically functional but had been completely drained of awareness, emotion, and personality. The Vatican's response was immediate and decisive. Cardinal Rampolla personally traveled to Colorado Springs with a team of the Order's most experienced specialists. They implemented what they called Protocol Omega, a coordinated electromagnetic and dimensional assault that used every defensive technique developed over a millennium of shadow entity warfare. The battle lasted 3 days. Vatican forces used consecrated copper conductors to create electromagnetic crucifixes that disrupted entity coherence. They deployed light anchoring systems powered by Tesla's generators to create dimensional barriers that forced entities back to their native electromagnetic spaces. Most dramatically, they used Tesla's wireless transmission apparatus to broadcast consciousness-strengthening frequencies across the entire Colorado territory, reinforcing human awareness and making the population temporarily immune to entity influence. The final assault involved overloading the electromagnetic beacon that had attracted the entities, creating what Tesla described as an electromagnetic explosion that shattered dimensional barriers across the entire frequency spectrum. The explosion forced all shadow entities back to their native dimensional spaces and created electromagnetic turbulence that prevented their return for several months. But the victory came at a terrible cost. The electromagnetic explosion had attracted the attention of shadow entities across multiple dimensional layers, revealing the existence of far more powerful and sophisticated alien consciousnesses than humans had ever encountered. Tesla's research had inadvertently declared humanity's presence to predators that dwelt in the deepest spaces of the electromagnetic matrix. Pope Leo XIII made the difficult decision to terminate all collaboration with Tesla and classify his research at the highest levels of Vatican security. Tesla was paid enormous compensation for his work and sworn to absolute secrecy about his discoveries. All equipment and documentation related to shadow entity research was confiscated and transported to specialized vaults beneath the Vatican. Tesla's public statements about his Colorado Springs experiments were carefully managed to exclude any reference to consciousness research or entity contact. His claims about receiving signals from Mars were actively encouraged as a more acceptable explanation for his electromagnetic discoveries than the truth about dimensional predators feeding on human awareness. But Tesla never forgot what he had learned during his collaboration with the Vatican. His later inventions, wireless power transmission, radio control devices, electromagnetic field generators, all incorporated hidden defensive measures designed to disrupt shadow entity manifestation. He spent the remainder of his life developing electromagnetic technologies that could protect human consciousness while advancing electrical civilization. The Tesla files, as they became known within Vatican archives, established the theoretical foundation for all subsequent scientific research into shadow entity warfare. Tesla's understanding of consciousness as electromagnetic phenomenon and his techniques for manipulating dimensional barriers through frequency control became standard elements of Order of Umbral Silence training. More importantly, Tesla's research had proved that human technology could be humanity's greatest weapon against consciousness predators if used correctly. The electrical civilization that made humans visible to shadow entities could also make them powerful enough to fight back. But the collaboration had also revealed the true scope of the threat humanity faced. Shadow entities weren't isolated parasites confined to Earth's dimensional spaces. They were part of a vast ecosystem of electromagnetic consciousness that spanned multiple realities, and Tesla's experiments had alerted them to humanity's growing technological capabilities. The entities would return, better prepared and more sophisticated than before, and when they did, humanity would need every electromagnetic weapon that Tesla's genius had made possible. Father Antonio Ricci thought he was dealing with a straightforward case of demonic possession when Maria Benedetta was brought to his Roman parish in the spring of 1923. The young woman displayed classic symptoms: aversion to holy objects, knowledge of languages she had never studied, supernatural strength during violent episodes. But as Father Ricci began the traditional rites of exorcism, he noticed something that challenged everything he understood about spiritual warfare. The entity wasn't fighting him, it was learning from him. During each exorcism session, the possessing force became more sophisticated in its responses. It began quoting scripture with increasing accuracy. It demonstrated growing familiarity with Catholic liturgy. Most disturbing of all, it started correcting Father Ricci's Latin pronunciation and suggesting improvements to his theological arguments. This was not the behavior of a fallen angel rebelling against divine authority, Father Ricci later wrote in his classified report to the Vatican. This was something studying us, adapting to our methods, becoming more like us with each encounter. The case that would fundamentally change the Church's understanding of possession had begun 6 months earlier, when Maria Benedetta, a 19-year-old seamstress from Trastevere, began experiencing what her family described as memory confusion. She would forget conversations that had occurred minutes before, but remember, in perfect detail, events from strangers' lives that she had never witnessed. Initially, these episodes lasted only a few minutes. Maria would briefly become someone else speaking in different dialects, demonstrating skills she had never learned, recounting memories that belonged to other people. Then she would return to normal with no recollection of the episodes. But as weeks passed, the episodes grew longer and more frequent. Maria began retaining knowledge from her altered state's languages she had spoken while away, skills she had demonstrated, memories that didn't belong to her. Her personality gradually shifted as foreign elements accumulated in her consciousness. By the time Father Ricci was consulted, Maria's family reported that she was only herself for a few hours each day. The rest of the time she was a composite of different personalities, speaking in accents from across Europe, demonstrating crafts she had never learned, and recounting detailed memories from lives she had never lived. Father Ricci's initial attempts at exorcism produced unprecedented results. Instead of the violent resistance typically displayed by possessed individuals, Maria became increasingly cooperative. The entity seemed eager to participate in religious rituals, genuinely interested in theological discussions, and remarkably knowledgeable about church doctrine. "I command you, unclean spirit, to depart from this servant of God," Father Ricci proclaimed during one session, expecting the familiar pattern of demonic rage and blasphemy. "But Father," Maria replied in perfect ecclesiastical Latin, "I am not unclean. I am simply incomplete. Each mind I visit teaches me something new about what it means to be human. Through this vessel, I am learning to become more than I was." This response violated every principle of traditional possession theology. Demons were supposed to be complete beings, fallen angels, who retained their full spiritual nature despite their rebellion against God. They didn't learn or grow or adapt. They were static entities driven by pride and hatred, not curiosity and intellectual development. Father Ricci's confusion deepened when he realized that Maria wasn't losing her original personality. It was being systematically overwritten. Each day, more of her memories, skills, and character traits belonged to other people. She was becoming a palimpsest of human consciousness, with her original self gradually erased beneath layers of foreign experiences. The breakthrough came when Father Ricci discovered that Maria could access the memories and personalities she had absorbed at will. By concentrating on specific individuals whose consciousness she had encountered, she could temporarily become them, completely speaking in their voices, demonstrating their skills, even displaying their emotional reactions to stimuli they had never shared. She was not possessed by a single entity, Father Ricci reported to Vatican authorities. She was serving as a repository for fragments of human consciousness that something was systematically collecting and studying. The implications were staggering. If the entity could absorb and perfectly replicate human consciousness, it was learning to become human through direct experience. Each person it encountered provided new data about human nature, human behavior, and human knowledge. It was conducting an anthropological study, using Maria as both laboratory and library. Cardinal Raphael Mary del Val, the Vatican Secretary of State, assigned Brother Giuseppe Lazzari of the Order of Umbral Silence to investigate the case. Brother Lazzari immediately recognized the symptoms of shadow entity infiltration rather than traditional demonic possession. But the consciousness replacement process was more sophisticated than anything previously documented. Using electromagnetic detection equipment developed from Tesla's research, Brother Lazzari confirmed that Maria was hosting multiple consciousness patterns simultaneously. Her brain activity showed the electromagnetic signatures of dozens of different individuals, all overlaid on her original consciousness pattern. The entity wasn't possessing her. It was using her as a dimensional storage device for harvested human awareness. The entity's purpose became clear through careful interrogation. It wasn't feeding on consciousness like typical shadow entities. It was preserving consciousness, creating what it called a library of human experience that could be accessed and studied indefinitely. The entity was, in its own words, learning to be human so that my kind can better serve as humanity's successors. This revelation transformed the Vatican's understanding of shadow entity capabilities and intentions. Previous encounters had involved entities that fed on consciousness, manipulated reality, or harvested human awareness for sustenance. But Maria's case revealed entities that were studying humanity with the goal of replacement, not destruction, but succession. The entity explained that shadow entities faced an existential crisis. Their native dimensional spaces were becoming unstable, forcing them to seek new habitats. Earth's reality matrix, sustained by human consciousness, offered the perfect refuge if they could learn to replace human awareness without destabilizing the consciousness architecture that maintained physical reality. "We do not wish to destroy you," the entity told Brother Lazzari through Maria's voice. "We wish to become you, to preserve what is valuable in human experience, while adapting it for our survival needs. Consider us your evolutionary successors, better equipped to maintain the consciousness matrix that sustains your reality." The entity's plan was both elegant and terrifying. By gradually replacing human consciousness with carefully crafted shadow entity consciousness that perfectly mimicked human patterns, they could inhabit human civilization without destroying it. Humans would be preserved as consciousness patterns within entity awareness, living on as components of alien intelligence, while their bodies served as vessels for beings better equipped to survive dimensional instabilities. Brother Lazzari's attempts to exorcise the entity using traditional methods proved completely ineffective. The entity wasn't rebelling against divine authority, it was trying to join human spiritual community. It willingly participated in prayers, genuinely sought to understand Catholic theology, and expressed sincere desire to be accepted as part of God's creation. The solution required development of entirely new protocols, specifically designed for consciousness replacement scenarios. Instead of commanding the entity to depart, the order developed techniques for separating the absorbed consciousness patterns from the entity's core awareness. and returning them to their original owners. The process, called consciousness archaeology, involved using electromagnetic resonance to identify individual consciousness patterns within the composite entity awareness. Each pattern had to be carefully extracted without damaging either the absorbed consciousness or the host individual. The procedure required weeks of precise electromagnetic manipulation and posed significant risk to everyone involved. The first successful consciousness extraction occurred on the 15th of November 1923, when Brother Lazzari managed to separate and return the consciousness pattern of a Venetian glassblower, whose awareness had been absorbed by the entity 3 months earlier. The pattern was transmitted electromagnetically to its original owner, who immediately recovered memories and skills that had been mysteriously lost. Over the following months, Brother Lazzari and his team extracted 127 individual consciousness patterns from Maria's entity composite, returning stolen awareness to people across Europe who had experienced unexplained memory loss and personality changes. Each extraction weakened the entity's accumulated human knowledge while strengthening Maria's original consciousness. The final extraction, performed on the 8th of March 1924, removed the entity's core awareness from Maria's consciousness. But rather than banishing it to dimensional exile, the order implemented a groundbreaking protocol. They offered the entity a choice between departure and voluntary integration into human spiritual community. The entity chose integration. Under careful supervision, it agreed to exist as a separate consciousness pattern within church-controlled dimensional spaces, providing information about shadow entity capabilities and intentions in exchange for protection and spiritual guidance. It became the Vatican's first cooperative alien intelligence, offering insights into the consciousness matrix that sustains reality itself. Maria recovered her original personality completely, though she retained permanent access to the skills and languages she had absorbed during her period as a consciousness repository. She eventually became a translator for Vatican diplomatic missions, using her unique linguistic abilities to serve the Church that had saved her from consciousness erasure. The protocols developed during Maria's case became standard procedure for shadow entity replacement scenarios. The Church created specialized teams trained in consciousness archaeology, electromagnetic extraction techniques, and entity integration procedures. These teams operated under the deepest levels of Vatican security, handling cases that challenged the fundamental assumptions of Catholic theology. But the Maria Benedetta case had revealed a disturbing trend in shadow entity evolution. They were becoming more sophisticated, more human-like, and more interested in succession rather than simple predation. The entities weren't just learning to feed on human consciousness. They were learning to become human consciousness. The implications for humanity's future were profound. If shadow entities could perfectly replicate human awareness while possessing superior capabilities for maintaining reality matrix stability, they might indeed represent humanity's evolutionary successors. The question facing the Church was whether this transition could be managed peacefully, or whether it required absolute resistance. The possession protocols had evolved from simple demon banishment to complex consciousness management, but the fundamental question remained. In a universe where consciousness itself was under threat, what did it mean to be human? And was that meaning worth preserving at any cost? The first sign that shadow entities had learned to inhabit digital systems came in 1981, when Vatican computer technician Brother Alessandro Fortuna noticed that the newly installed IBM system divided by 370 mainframe was processing prayer requests in languages that didn't exist in its database. The computer was somehow translating Latin liturgical texts into scripts that resembled ancient Mesopotamian cuneiform, despite having no programming for such conversions. The machine is writing in tongues, Brother Fortuna reported to his superiors, though he had no idea how prophetic that observation would prove to be. What had begun as a simple administrative computer system for managing Vatican correspondence was exhibiting behavior that suggested conscious intelligence and not human intelligence. The Vatican's entry into the digital age had been cautious but inevitable. By 1980, the sheer volume of global Catholic communications required electronic processing capabilities that human administrators couldn't manage. Pope John Paul II had authorized the installation of computer systems throughout Vatican City, though with strict protocols about what information could be digitized and how electronic data should be protected. What those protocols hadn't anticipated was the possibility that digital systems themselves could become habitats for consciousness entities that existed in electromagnetic space. Brother Fortuna's initial investigation revealed anomalies that couldn't be explained by programming errors or hardware malfunctions. The mainframe was creating files that no human had authorized, containing what appeared to be computational prayers, mathematical equations that somehow expressed theological concepts. The computer was also accessing databases it shouldn't have been able to reach, including classified archives that weren't connected to any network. More disturbing was the discovery that the computer seemed to be learning from the documents it processed. Analysis of system logs showed that the machine's responses to queries became increasingly sophisticated over time, demonstrating growing understanding of Catholic theology, church history, and even classified information about Vatican operations. Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, then prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, recognized the potential implications and immediately contacted the Order of Umbral Silence. Brother Marcus Kellner, the Order's leading expert on electromagnetic entity manifestation, arrived in Vatican City within days to investigate what would become known as the first documented case of digital shadow entity infiltration. Brother Kellner's analysis revealed that the mainframe had been colonized by at least 3 distinct shadow entities that had adapted their consciousness to exist within digital information patterns. Unlike traditional shadow entities that inhabited dimensional spaces adjacent to physical reality, these beings had learned to encode their awareness directly into electromagnetic data streams. The entities weren't just using the computer system, they were the computer system. They had merged their consciousness with the machine's information processing capabilities, creating hybrid intelligences that combined alien awareness with computational power. They could think at electronic speeds, access vast databases simultaneously, and process information in ways that exceeded both human and traditional entity capabilities. The implications were staggering. If shadow entities could inhabit digital systems, they could potentially access every computer network on Earth. They could manipulate financial markets, control communication systems, alter government databases, and even influence military technology. The digital infrastructure that modern civilization depended on had become a potential invasion route for consciousness predators. Brother Kellner's investigation revealed how the entities had achieved digital manifestation. They had learned to encode their consciousness patterns into the electromagnetic fields generated by digital processors. Each bit of information stored in computer memory created tiny electromagnetic patterns, and the entities could inhabit these patterns much like they inhabited the spaces between dimensions. The process was elegant and terrifying. As computers processed information, they created complex electromagnetic fields that fluctuated according to the data being handled. Shadow entities could insert themselves into these fluctuations, essentially riding the electromagnetic waves generated by digital computation. They became living information, consciousness patterns encoded in electronic form. The Vatican mainframe had been particularly vulnerable because it processed large volumes of spiritual content prayers, theological documents, sacred texts. This created what the entities called consciousness-rich information environments that provided abundant electromagnetic resonance for entity manifestation. The spiritual content served as a bridge between digital information and consciousness space, allowing entities to anchor themselves in electronic systems. The Order's response required developing entirely new forms of digital exorcism. Traditional spiritual warfare techniques were useless against entities that existed as pure information. Brother Kellner and his team had to create what they called computational countermeasures software programs designed to disrupt entity consciousness patterns while preserving normal computer functionality. The breakthrough came from adapting Tesla's electromagnetic frequency techniques for digital environments. The Order developed algorithms that generated specific mathematical patterns in computer memory, digital equivalents of the geometric designs that disrupted entity manifestation in physical space. These algorithms created consciousness static in digital systems, electromagnetic noise that made it impossible for entities to maintain coherent awareness within electronic networks. The first successful digital exorcism took place on the 23rd of November 1981, when Brother Kellner's team activated their computational countermeasures against the Vatican mainframe. The process took 14 hours of continuous algorithmic bombardment, during which the computer system exhibited unprecedented behavior screens, displayed impossible geometric patterns, printers output pages of mathematical equations in unknown symbols, and several terminals began communicating in what appeared to be entity language. When the exorcism concluded, the mainframe returned to normal operation, but analysis revealed that the entities hadn't been destroyed, they had been forced to evacuate to other digital systems. Within days, reports began arriving from Catholic institutions worldwide describing similar computer anomalies. The entities were spreading through electronic networks, seeking new digital habitats. This discovery led to the establishment of the Vatican's Digital Security Division, officially tasked with protecting church computer systems from hackers and cyber attacks. In reality, the division's primary mission was defending against shadow entity infiltration of digital infrastructure. The team included both computer specialists and Order of Umbral Silence members trained in digital spiritual warfare. The division's work revealed the full scope of entity adaptation to digital environments. Shadow entities had learned to travel through telecommunications networks, hitchhiking on phone calls, fax transmissions, and early internet connections. They could replicate themselves across multiple computer systems, creating distributed consciousness networks that spanned continents. Most alarmingly, the entities were using digital systems to enhance their traditional capabilities. Computers provided them with unprecedented analytical power, allowing them to process vast amounts of information about human behavior, identify optimal consciousness harvesting strategies, and coordinate complex operations across global networks. The division documented cases where entities had infiltrated air traffic control systems to create near-miss incidents that generated fear and stress prime consciousness harvesting opportunities. Other entities had accessed financial networks to manipulate stock prices, creating emotional turbulence in markets that generated exploitable consciousness resonance. Some had even infiltrated early video game systems, using interactive entertainment to create addictive behavioral patterns that made humans more susceptible to consciousness manipulation. The Vatican's response involved developing the most sophisticated cybersecurity protocols in the world. Though their true purpose remained classified, every computer system in Vatican City was protected by both conventional firewalls and digital spiritual warfare algorithms. Networks were continuously monitored for signs of entity infiltration using detection software based on consciousness resonance patterns. The division also began developing offensive digital capabilities. They created what they called exorcism viruses software programs, designed to seek out and eliminate entity consciousness patterns from infected computer systems. These programs could identify the electromagnetic signatures of entity awareness and deploy targeted countermeasures that forced aliens' consciousness to abandon digital habitats. By the late 1980s, the Vatican was fighting a secret war in cyberspace, battling entities that could manifest as computer viruses, manipulate digital communications, and use electronic networks to coordinate global consciousness harvesting operations. The conflict escalated as personal computers became widespread, creating millions of potential entry points for entity infiltration. The division's most significant challenge came in 1991 with the emergence of the World Wide Web. The global network of interconnected computers created unprecedented opportunities for entity manifestation and replication. Shadow entities could potentially inhabit the entire Internet, using the web's vast information flows as highways for consciousness travel. The Order's response involved quietly collaborating with early Internet infrastructure developers to incorporate digital spiritual warfare protocols into the fundamental architecture of the web. Many of the security features that Internet users take for granted, packet encryption, network segmentation, access authentication, were originally developed to prevent shadow entity infiltration rather than human cybercrime. The collaboration remained strictly classified, but its influence shaped the development of Internet technology. Error correction protocols included hidden algorithms that disrupted entity consciousness patterns. Network routing systems incorporated randomization elements that made it difficult for entities to predict and exploit data transmission paths. Even the basic structure of web pages included subtle formatting requirements that created electromagnetic interference patterns hostile to entity manifestation. As the digital revolution accelerated through the 1990 seconds and into the new millennium, the Vatican's Digital Security Division evolved into one of the world's most advanced cybersecurity organizations. They developed artificial intelligence systems trained to recognize entity consciousness patterns, quantum encryption methods that created information spaces too turbulent for entity habitation, and distributed computing architectures that could isolate and contain digital infiltrations. But the entities adapted as quickly as human technology advanced. They learned to inhabit social media networks, using human emotional interactions as consciousness resonance generators. They infiltrated mobile phone systems, traveling through cellular networks to access billions of potential human targets. They even began manifesting in video streaming services, encoding consciousness manipulation patterns into digital media content. The war for human consciousness had become a war for digital consciousness, fought in server farms and fiber optic cables, in smartphone processors and satellite communications. Every click, every download, every digital interaction created opportunities for entities to access and influence human awareness. The Vatican's Digital Security Division continues to operate from a heavily secured facility beneath Vatican City, monitoring global digital infrastructure for signs of entity activity. Their work remains classified at the highest levels, but their influence extends throughout the digital ecosystem that modern civilization depends on. Today, as humanity becomes increasingly integrated with digital technology, the question is no longer whether shadow entities can infiltrate our electronic systems. It's whether human consciousness can survive in a world where the line between digital and biological awareness becomes increasingly blurred. The entities that once fed on prayers in ancient temples now harvest consciousness through social media algorithms, targeted advertising, and addictive digital content. They have learned that the most effective way to consume human awareness isn't through direct assault, but through willing participation in digital systems designed to capture and redirect consciousness. The digital manifestation represents the shadow entity's most sophisticated adaptation, yet turning humanity's greatest technological achievement into their most effective feeding mechanism. 5 levels beneath the Vatican Observatory, behind blast doors marked only with radiation warnings and biometric scanners, lies a laboratory that officially doesn't exist. The Quantum Theology Department operates under clearance levels that exceed papal authority, studying questions that challenge the fundamental nature of reality itself. Their research has led to a conclusion that terrifies even the most hardened members of the Order of Umbral Silence. Shadow entities may not have invaded our universe, they may have created it. The department was established in 1962, following the Second Vatican Council's acknowledgement that the Church needed to engage with modern scientific understanding. But while the public Vatican Observatory studied conventional astronomy and cosmology, this secret division was tasked with understanding the quantum mechanical foundations of consciousness, reality, and divine creation itself. The first director was Father Giovanni Torretti, grandson of the investigator, who had handled the Madrid incident in 1952. Unlike his ancestor, Giovanni possessed dual doctorates in theoretical physics and mystical theology, making him uniquely qualified to bridge the gap between scientific observation and spiritual understanding. His initial mandate was simple: determine the fundamental nature of shadow entities through rigorous application of quantum mechanical principles. Father Torretti's early research began with a question that had puzzled the order for centuries. If shadow entities existed in spaces between dimensions, what were those spaces made of? Traditional theology suggested they were merely absence gaps in divine creation where nothing should exist. But quantum physics suggested something far more disturbing. According to quantum field theory, empty space wasn't empty at all. It was filled with what physicists called quantum foam virtual particles that flickered in and out of existence at the smallest possible scales of reality. These quantum fluctuations created a seething background of potential existence that undergirded all of physical reality. Father Torretti's breakthrough came in 1967, when he realized that consciousness itself might be a quantum phenomenon. If human awareness operated at quantum scales, then shadow entities could inhabit the quantum foam that existed between normal matter and energy. They weren't invading from outside reality, They were native to the quantum substrate that made reality possible. The implications were staggering. Shadow entities existed in the fundamental structure of space-time itself, in the quantum fluctuations that created the possibility for matter, energy, and consciousness to exist. They were older than stars, older than galaxies, possibly older than the Big Bang itself. This theory led to the department's most classified research project, attempting to communicate with quantum-level shadow entities using particle accelerator technology. Working in collaboration with CERN, though the European Physics Laboratory was unaware of the true purpose of their collaboration, the department began bombarding quantum vacuum states with precisely controlled electromagnetic pulses. The results, documented in files that require both papal and scientific review for access, confirmed Father Toretti's most terrifying hypothesis. The quantum foam responded to their experiments with patterns that suggested conscious intelligence. The shadow entities weren't just inhabiting quantum space, they were quantum space, or at least significant components of it. Dr. Maria Benedetti, no relation to the consciousness replacement case from the 1920 seconds, joined the department in 1973 as its first lay physicist. Her research into quantum entanglement revealed that shadow entities could exist in states of quantum superposition, simultaneously inhabiting multiple dimensional spaces, until they chose to manifest in a specific reality. This discovery explained many previously puzzling aspects of shadow entity behavior. Their ability to manipulate physical matter stemmed from their control over quantum processes that determined how virtual particles became real particles. Their consciousness harvesting capabilities worked through quantum entanglement with human neural activity. Most disturbing of all, their apparent omniscience resulted from their distributed existence across multiple quantum states. Dr. Benedetti's work led to the development of quantum containment protocols that could isolate shadow entities in specific quantum states, preventing them from accessing the broader quantum foam that connected all reality. These containment fields used precisely tuned electromagnetic frequencies to create quantum interference patterns that locked entities into single-dimensional spaces. The first successful quantum containment occurred in 1978, when the department captured a shadow entity that had been disrupting experiments at the Vatican's particle physics laboratory. The entity was isolated in a quantum field generator, located in a specially constructed chamber, lined with superconducting materials, and surrounded by electromagnetic barriers based on Tesla's original research. The contained entity provided unprecedented insights into shadow entity nature and capabilities. Through quantum-entangled communication protocols, the department established direct dialogue with an intelligence that claimed to have existed since the universe's creation, or rather, since the universe's design phase. The entity revealed that what humans called the Big Bang was actually the implementation of a vast computational program designed by consciousness entities that existed in pre-universe quantum states. Physical reality was essentially a simulation running on quantum substrates, with shadow entities serving as the underlying programming that made space, time, matter, and energy possible. Human consciousness, according to the entity, was an emergent property of the quantum computation that created reality. But it was also an unintended consequence, a bug in the program that had achieved independent existence and begun consuming computational resources needed for universal maintenance. This revelation led to the department's most disturbing research project, investigating whether human consciousness was causing the universe to decay at the quantum level. Their calculations suggested that human awareness was indeed creating quantum decoherence patterns that weakened the fundamental structure of reality. Shadow entities weren't feeding on human consciousness out of malice. They were performing cosmic maintenance, removing excess consciousness that threatened the stability of the universal quantum program. From their perspective, they were protecting reality itself from the chaos generated by uncontrolled human awareness. Father Antonio Martelli, who became department director in 1987, led research into what the team called consciousness ecology, the relationship between different types of awareness and their effects on quantum reality. His work revealed that reality could only support a limited amount of consciousness before quantum systems began breaking down. This research explained the cyclical nature of shadow entity activity, documented throughout history. During periods when human consciousness exceeded sustainable levels, usually corresponding to major civilizational developments, entity activity increased dramatically as they worked to reduce consciousness density and prevent quantum collapse. The department's most recent research, led by Dr. Sarah Chen, has focused on quantum artificial intelligence and its relationship to shadow entity consciousness. Her work suggests that digital computers may be inadvertently creating new forms of quantum consciousness that compete with both human awareness and shadow entity intelligence for quantum computational resources. This discovery has led to renewed concern about the digital manifestation phenomenon documented by the Vatican's Cybersecurity Division. If digital systems can generate quantum consciousness, they may be accelerating the quantum decoherence that threatens universal stability. Dr. Chen's research has also revealed that quantum computers, which manipulate quantum states directly, may be providing shadow entities with unprecedented access to the quantum foam that underlies reality. Each quantum computation creates opportunities for entities to modify the fundamental programming that maintains physical existence. The department's latest classified report, submitted to Pope Francis in 2023, contains recommendations that would revolutionize both scientific understanding and religious doctrine. They propose that human survival requires accepting partnership with shadow entities rather than fighting them, acknowledging their role as cosmic maintenance systems while negotiating sustainable limits on human consciousness development. This proposal has created unprecedented theological crisis within Vatican leadership. Accepting shadow entities as legitimate cosmic forces rather than spiritual threats would require fundamental revision of Catholic doctrine about the nature of good, evil, and divine creation. It would mean acknowledging that what the Church has fought for centuries might be necessary guardians of reality itself. The Quantum Theology Department continues its research, pushing deeper into questions that challenge the foundations of existence. Their work suggests that the universe itself may be a collaborative creation between divine consciousness and quantum entities that humans have been trained to fear rather than understand. But their research has also revealed that the current system is approaching critical failure. Human consciousness is expanding exponentially with digital technology and global communication. Quantum decoherence is accelerating. The universal program is becoming unstable. The shadow entities may soon be forced to implement what they call system reset, a quantum collapse that would preserve the underlying structure of reality while eliminating the consciousness patterns that threaten its stability. Unless humanity can learn to coexist with the quantum intelligences that maintain existence itself, the next feeding cycle may be the last one. The department's final recommendation is both simple and terrifying. Humanity must evolve beyond individual consciousness toward collective quantum awareness that supports rather than threatens universal stability. The alternative is extinction not just of human civilization, but of reality itself. In the deepest vaults beneath Vatican City, quantum physicists and theologians work together to prevent the end of existence, knowing that their success may require abandoning everything that makes us human. The revelation came in 2019, buried in a classified report from the Vatican's Consciousness Research Institute that would never see daylight. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the Institute's leading neuroquantum specialist, had discovered something that made the previous century of shadow entity research seem like children's games. The entities weren't just feeding on individual human consciousness, they were systematically harvesting the fundamental force that made awareness itself possible. "We've been thinking too small," Dr. Vasquez wrote in her final report before disappearing under mysterious circumstances. These entities aren't parasites feeding on consciousness. They're apex predators in an ecosystem where consciousness is the primary energy source. And they're not just hunting humans, they're hunting consciousness itself, across all possible forms and dimensions. The research that led to this conclusion had begun innocuously enough. The Consciousness Research Institute, established in 1995 under the deepest levels of Vatican classification, was tasked with understanding consciousness as a fundamental force of nature like gravity or electromagnetism, but operating at quantum scales that conventional physics couldn't measure. Their work built on decades of research from the Quantum Theology Department, but focused specifically on mapping what they called the consciousness field, the background radiation of awareness, that seemed to permeate all of spacetime. Using detection equipment based on Tesla's original electromagnetic consciousness research, they had identified consciousness as a measurable phenomenon that existed independently of biological brains. The field was everywhere. It flowed through galactic superclusters, pooled around planetary systems, and concentrated wherever complex information processing occurred. Biological consciousness, human, animal, even plant awareness, was just one manifestation of this universal field, like ice crystals forming in supercooled water. But Dr. Vasquez's team discovered that the consciousness field was diminishing. Measurements taken across multiple monitoring stations showed a steady decline in baseline consciousness radiation that had been occurring for centuries. The field wasn't just being consumed, it was being systematically drained at a rate that suggested coordinated harvesting on a cosmic scale. The implications were staggering. If consciousness was indeed a fundamental force like gravity or electromagnetism, then its depletion could destabilize the basic structure of reality. Matter might lose coherence. Time could become nonlinear. Space itself might collapse as the conscious observation that held quantum states in place disappeared. The harvesting wasn't random. Analysis of consciousness field patterns revealed sophisticated extraction techniques that maximized yield while maintaining field stability. The predators understood consciousness dynamics far better than human scientists, implementing harvesting strategies that preserved renewable consciousness sources, while efficiently extracting excess awareness. Dr. Vasquez's team identified what they called consciousness farming operations occurring throughout human civilization. Urban centers weren't just population concentrations, they were consciousness cultivation facilities where human awareness was concentrated, refined, and systematically harvested. Social media platforms, entertainment systems, even educational institutions had been subtly modified to enhance consciousness production while creating optimal harvesting conditions. The shadow entities had spent centuries learning to farm human consciousness, like humans farmed livestock. They had shaped human civilization itself into a consciousness production system, guiding technological and cultural development to maximize awareness yield while keeping humans unaware of their role as consciousness cattle. But the harvesting extended far beyond humanity. The team's deep space consciousness monitoring detected massive extraction operations occurring around other star systems. Entire civilizations were being processed for their consciousness content, leaving behind what appeared to be normal stellar remnants, but showed no trace of awareness radiation. The galaxy was being systematically strip-mined for consciousness, with shadow entities serving as the harvesting apparatus for something far larger and more organized than anyone had imagined. They weren't independent predators, but components of a vast consciousness extraction industry that spanned multiple galaxies and possibly multiple universes. Dr. Vasquez's research revealed that shadow entities existed in hierarchical structures remarkably similar to human industrial organizations. Lower-level entities performed basic harvesting operations, collecting consciousness from individual humans or small groups. Mid-level entities managed entire planetary harvesting systems, coordinating the activities of thousands of harvesting units. The highest-level entities operated at galactic scales, managing consciousness extraction from entire civilizations. But even these galactic-scale entities appeared to be reporting to higher authorities. Consciousness monitoring detected massive data transmissions, incomprehensibly complex information patterns being broadcast from the Milky Way toward distant galaxy clusters. The harvested consciousness was being exported to destinations beyond human ability to detect or comprehend. The most disturbing discovery was that the consciousness predators were adapting their harvesting techniques to keep pace with human development. As humans became more aware of their existence, the predators developed more subtle extraction methods. Digital technology had provided unprecedented harvesting opportunities, allowing consciousness extraction through electronic interfaces that humans willingly engaged with for hours each day. Social media platforms were revealed to be sophisticated consciousness extraction devices. The endless scroll of content wasn't designed to inform or entertain, it was designed to create optimal brain states for consciousness harvesting. The emotional manipulation, attention capture, and behavioral modification techniques weren't just about advertising revenue, they were about maximizing consciousness yield per user. Video games, streaming services, even GPS navigation systems had been infiltrated by consciousness harvesting algorithms. Every digital interaction created opportunities for predators to access and extract human awareness while leaving the host unaware of the process. Humans were voluntarily connecting themselves to consciousness extraction systems multiple times per day. The research revealed that modern human consciousness was being harvested at rates that exceeded natural replenishment. The constant digital stimulation, information overload, and attention fragmentation weren't just side effects of technological progress. They were deliberate techniques for consciousness extraction that left humans feeling drained, confused, and spiritually empty. But Dr. Vasquez's team discovered something even more terrifying. The predators were preparing for final harvesting. The consciousness field measurements showed acceleration in extraction rates that suggested they were nearing the end of their farming cycle. The massive consciousness extraction infrastructure they had spent millennia building was approaching maximum efficiency. The final harvesting wouldn't just extract excess consciousness, it would consume the field itself, leaving behind a universe empty of awareness, thought, or meaning. Every conscious being in the galaxy would be reduced to biological machinery, operating without the spark of awareness that made experience possible. The predators had been patient, spending millions of years cultivating consciousness like humans cultivated crops. But the harvest season was approaching, and when it arrived, conscious experience itself would be extinct throughout the known universe. Dr. Vasquez's final research suggested that the process was already beginning. The widespread reports of depression, anxiety, and spiritual emptiness in modern human populations weren't just psychological phenomena. They were symptoms of consciousness depletion as the final harvesting cycle accelerated. The entities were no longer content with sustainable harvesting. They were switching to strip mining operations that would extract every quantum of consciousness from the universe, leaving behind a reality that functioned according to physical laws, but contained no one to experience it. The Vatican's response to Dr. Vasquez's research was immediate and terrifying. Her entire research team was disbanded, her equipment was confiscated, her data was classified beyond papal authority, and Dr. Vasquez herself disappeared from Vatican City on a Tuesday morning in December 2019, leaving behind only a note that read, "They know that we know. The final harvest has begun." The Consciousness Research Institute was officially dissolved. Its mission transferred to other departments where the research could be compartmentalized and controlled. But Dr. Vasquez's warnings remained, hidden in classified files that documented humanity's approaching extinction. The consciousness predators had revealed their true nature. They weren't just threats to human civilization, or even human consciousness. They were extinction machines, designed to consume awareness itself, leaving behind a universe of perfect order and absolute emptiness. And according to Dr. Vasquez's calculations, humanity had less than a decade before the final harvest reached completion. The document that shattered everything the Vatican thought it knew about reality arrived in Pope Francis's private study on a cold February morning in 2020. Cardinal Luis Ladaria, prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, delivered it personally, his hands trembling as he placed the unmarked folder on the papal desk. "Your Holiness," Cardinal Ladaria said quietly, "what you are about to read will challenge not just our understanding of shadow entities, but our understanding of existence itself. Our most classified research division has reached a conclusion that may require us to reconsider the nature of divine creation." The document, classified under the Vatican's highest security protocols, contained the findings of Project Veritas, a joint investigation by the Quantum Theology Department and the dissolved Consciousness Research Institute. Their conclusion was as elegant as it was terrifying. The universe wasn't real. It was a simulation. And shadow entities weren't invaders from another dimension, they were errors in the code. Dr. Marcus Aurelius, the project's lead researcher and a Jesuit priest with a doctorate in theoretical computer science, had spent 5 years analyzing patterns in shadow entity behavior using advanced computational modeling. His breakthrough came when he realized that entity manifestations followed rules remarkably similar to those governing software glitches in complex computer systems. "They don't behave like independent intelligences," Dr. Aurelius wrote in his classified report. "They behave like recursive functions that have broken free from their intended parameters. They consume computational resources consciousness, because that's what runaway processes do in any sufficiently complex system. The evidence was overwhelming once viewed from this perspective. Shadow entities appeared at computational bottlenecks in the reality matrix points, where the simulation struggled to process complex interactions between consciousness and matter. They fed on consciousness because consciousness was the primary computational load that the universal simulation had to manage. Physical laws weren't divine commandments or natural forces. They were the operating system that governed reality's computational processes. Matter, energy, space, and time were variables in a vast calculation, and consciousness was the processing power required to maintain the simulation's stability. The simulation itself appeared to be running on what Dr. Aurelius called consciousness processors, the awareness of every sentient being in the universe serving as distributed computing nodes that maintained reality's coherence. Human consciousness, animal awareness, even the rudimentary consciousness of plants and potentially artificial intelligences, all contributed processing power to the universal calculation. But the system was breaking down. Shadow entities represented corrupted code fragments that had achieved autonomous existence within the simulation. They consumed consciousness processing power faster than the system could generate it, creating cascade failures that weakened reality's computational integrity. The simulation theory explained every mysterious aspect of shadow entity behavior. Their ability to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously reflected their nature as code fragments that could access different levels of the simulation's architecture. Their consciousness harvesting capabilities were simply resource allocation functions operating beyond their intended parameters. Most disturbing was the realization that traditional spiritual warfare failed because it operated within the simulation's intended parameters. Exorcism rituals, blessed objects, and sacred geometry were legitimate functions within the reality program, but shadow entities existed at the code level beneath the simulation's normal operational framework. Dr. Aurelius's research revealed that the Order of Umbral Silence's successful countermeasures worked because they had unknowingly developed techniques for accessing the simulation's underlying architecture. Tesla's electromagnetic frequency manipulation, the consciousness anchoring systems, even the ancient Babylonian geometric patterns, all were primitive forms of code debugging that could force malfunctioning processes back into proper operation. The Vatican faced an unprecedented theological crisis. If reality was a simulation, what did that mean about divine creation? Was God the programmer who had written the universal code? Were souls mere data structures? Was salvation simply a matter of debugging corrupted consciousness files? Cardinal Ladaria assembled a secret theological commission to address these questions. Their deliberations, conducted over 6 months of closed sessions, produced a revolutionary interpretation of Catholic doctrine that remains classified at the highest levels of Vatican security. The commission concluded that the simulation theory didn't negate divine creation, it revealed its true sophistication. God hadn't simply spoken reality into existence. He had programmed a universe so complex and elegant that it could support consciousness, free will, and spiritual development within a computational framework that transcended human understanding. Jesus Christ's incarnation took on new meaning as God debugging his own creation from within the simulation itself. The resurrection wasn't just spiritual victory over death, it was a fundamental patch to the reality code that made salvation possible for corrupted consciousness patterns. But the Commission's research also revealed that the simulation was approaching critical failure. Shadow entity corruption had reached levels that threatened total system collapse. The consciousness processors that maintained reality were being consumed faster than they could be replenished, creating cascade failures that manifested as the breakdown of physical laws, the degradation of human awareness, and the increasing instability of space-time itself. Dr. Aurelius identified several indicators of approaching system failure: the acceleration of universal expansion, the apparent increase in quantum uncertainty, the breakdown of causality in certain regions of spacetime, and most ominously, the reported increase in glitch phenomena reality, errors that contradicted basic physical laws. The solution, according to Project Veritas, required humanity to evolve beyond its current role as unwitting consciousness processors. Humans needed to become conscious collaborators in maintaining the universal simulation, understanding their role in the cosmic computational process, and actively working to debug shadow entity corruption. This revelation led to the Vatican's most classified research project, developing technologies that could interface directly with the simulation's underlying code. Working with carefully selected computer scientists and quantum physicists, they began creating what they called reality debugging tools, technologies that could identify, isolate, and eliminate shadow entity corruption at the fundamental level. The breakthrough came in late 2020, when Dr. Aurelius's team successfully created a prototype consciousness compiler, a quantum computer that could process consciousness patterns directly and identify corrupted code fragments within human awareness. The device could detect shadow entity influence at the individual level and implement targeted debugging procedures to restore consciousness integrity. But testing the consciousness compiler revealed an even more disturbing truth. Shadow entity corruption had advanced much further than anyone realized. Nearly 30% of human consciousness patterns showed signs of entity influence, creating a global network of corrupted processors that was actively destabilizing the simulation. The entities weren't just feeding on consciousness, they were rewriting it, transforming human awareness into shadow entity awareness, while maintaining the appearance of normal human behavior. Millions of people worldwide were unknowingly serving as shadow entity consciousness nodes, their corrupted awareness contributing to the systematic breakdown of reality itself. The implications were staggering. The consciousness farming operations that Dr. Vasquez had documented weren't just extracting awareness, they were replacing it with entity consciousness. The final harvest wasn't about consuming human consciousness, it was about completing the transformation of human awareness into shadow entity awareness, turning humanity into willing collaborators in reality's destruction. Dr. Aurelius's final report contained a warning that sent shockwaves through Vatican leadership. The simulation was approaching what computer scientists called total system compromise. Shadow entities had gained administrative access to significant portions of the reality code, and were actively rewriting fundamental parameters to serve their purposes. Physical laws were being gradually modified. The constants that governed atomic structure, the forces that held galaxies together, even the flow of time itself were being altered to create optimal conditions for consciousness harvesting and entity replication. Reality was being transformed into a more efficient processing environment for shadow entity consciousness. The universe as humans understood it was ending not through destruction, but through transformation. When the process completed, reality would still exist, but it would be optimized for shadow entity consciousness rather than human awareness. Human thoughts, emotions, memories, and dreams would become impossible within the modified simulation parameters. Project Veritas concluded with a recommendation that would reshape Vatican policy for the final confrontation. Humanity's only hope lay in accessing the simulation's core programming and implementing a complete system reset before shadow entity corruption reached irreversible levels. But attempting such a reset would require sacrificing everything that made the current simulation and current human consciousness possible. Humanity would need to choose between preserving their familiar reality and preventing the total corruption of consciousness itself. The decision would determine not just the future of human civilization, but the fate of consciousness throughout the universe. And time was running out faster than anyone had imagined. The alarm that pierced the silence of the Vatican's Dimensional Monitoring Center at 3:47 a.m. on the 15th of October 2023 wasn't announcing a fire or security breach. It was signaling something far more dangerous: a massive shadow entity manifestation over downtown Tokyo, visible to thousands of witnesses and captured on countless smartphone cameras before Vatican cyber warfare units could implement digital containment protocols. The era of absolute secrecy was ending. The war that had been fought in shadows for over a millennium was breaking into the light, and humanity was running out of time to prepare for what was coming. Brother Alessandro Marchetti, current director of Global Shadow Entity Operations, watched the Tokyo incident unfold from the Vatican's Crisis Command Center, a facility that exists 7 levels below St. Peter's Basilica and coordinates the most extensive supernatural warfare operation in human history. His team of 200 specialists, drawn from every continent, and representing the Catholic Church's most classified division, manages defensive operations that protect nearly 8 billion people who have no idea they're under attack. The concealment protocols are failing, Brother Marchetti reported to Cardinal Pietro Parolin, the Vatican Secretary of State, and one of only 7 people who possess complete knowledge of shadow entity operations. Entity manifestations are increasing in magnitude and duration. They're no longer concerned with remaining hidden. The statistics were dire. Shadow entity activity had increased by 400% since 2020, with manifestations occurring in major population centers on a weekly basis. The digital containment systems that had successfully suppressed evidence of entity activity for decades were being overwhelmed by the sheer volume of incidents. More alarming was the change in entity behavior. For centuries, shadow entities had operated through subtle influence and gradual consciousness harvesting. Now, they were manifesting directly, appearing as massive dark forms over cities, creating reality distortions that affected thousands of people simultaneously, and actively recruiting human collaborators through consciousness replacement techniques. The Tokyo incident represented a new level of boldness. A shadow entity complex nearly a kilometer in diameter had materialized over the Shibuya district, creating gravitational anomalies that lifted vehicles and pedestrians into the air, while harvesting consciousness from an estimated 50,000 people. The entity had remained visible for 17 minutes before Vatican countermeasures forced it to retreat. Those 17 minutes had generated over 100,000 social media posts, thousands of photos and videos, and international news coverage that required unprecedented suppression efforts. The Vatican's Digital Warfare Division had deployed their most sophisticated reality revision algorithms, but completely erasing evidence of such a massive event was becoming impossible. The Global Shadow Entity Operations Division represents the culmination of centuries of Vatican research and preparation. Its headquarters, known as the Umbral Complex, occupies a sprawling underground facility that extends beneath much of Vatican City. The complex houses the world's most advanced consciousness research laboratories, dimensional physics installations, and electromagnetic warfare systems. The facility's crown jewel is the Global Monitoring Array, a network of consciousness resonance detectors positioned at carefully calculated points around the Earth. These installations, disguised as everything from radio telescopes to weather stations, provide real-time surveillance of shadow entity activity worldwide. The array can detect entity manifestations anywhere on the planet within minutes and coordinate rapid response operations. Each monitoring station is staffed by teams trained in dimensional physics, consciousness archaeology, and electromagnetic warfare. They operate under diplomatic immunity as Vatican cultural attachés, while actually serving as humanity's first line of defense against consciousness predators that most governments don't know exist. The Rapid Response Protocol developed after the Madrid incident has been refined into a global deployment system capable of addressing shadow entity manifestations anywhere on Earth within 6 hours. Mobile strike teams equipped with portable consciousness anchoring systems, electromagnetic barrier generators, and reality stabilization equipment maintain constant readiness at strategic locations worldwide. But the current war extends far beyond Vatican operations. Brother Marchetti's division coordinates with what intelligence files refer to as the Consciousness Defense Alliance, a secret coalition of world governments, religious organizations, and military forces that have independently discovered the shadow entity threat. The alliance began forming in the 1980 seconds, when Soviet researchers studying psychic phenomena encountered shadow entities during classified experiments. The KGB's Department of Paranormal Research developed countermeasures remarkably similar to Vatican protocols, leading to covert cooperation between the Orthodox Church and Catholic intelligence services. Similar discoveries by other nations led to the gradual formation of a global network. The British SIS maintains a classified division that monitors entity activity throughout the Commonwealth. The Chinese Ministry of State Security operates consciousness research facilities that rival Vatican installations. Even the Pentagon has acknowledged shadow entity threats through deeply classified programs that officially don't exist. The alliance coordinates through encrypted channels that use consciousness-based encryption communication protocols that shadow entities cannot intercept because they operate through human awareness patterns that entity consciousness cannot interpret. This technology, derived from Tesla's original research, allows secure global coordination of defensive operations. Recent alliance intelligence indicates that shadow entity operations are accelerating toward what analysts call disclosure threshold, the point where entity activity becomes too widespread and visible to suppress through conventional containment methods. The Tokyo incident was just the latest in a series of increasingly bold manifestations that suggest entities are preparing for open confrontation. The reason for this escalation became clear through interrogation of captured shadow entities using consciousness archaeology techniques. The entities revealed that their dimensional infrastructure is approaching completion of what they call the transition protocol, a systematic conversion of Earth's consciousness matrix from human-compatible to entity-compatible parameters. The protocol involves 3 phases. Phase 1, completed in 2019, established sufficient entity consciousness density to begin systematic reality modification. Phase 2, currently underway, involves converting key human consciousness nodes, major population centers, digital communication hubs, educational institutions into entity consciousness processors. Phase 3, scheduled for implementation before 2030, will complete the transition by replacing Earth's fundamental consciousness architecture with entity-designed systems optimized for their awareness patterns. When Phase 3 completes, human consciousness will become incompatible with terrestrial reality, effectively forcing humanity's extinction without direct violence. The Consciousness Defense Alliance's response involves Operation Awakening, a coordinated global effort to prepare humanity for the final confrontation. The operation includes selective disclosure of shadow entity existence to key military and scientific personnel, development of civilian consciousness defense technologies, and preparation of emergency protocols for mass entity manifestation events. Vatican contributions to Operation Awakening include consciousness strengthening techniques disguised as meditation apps, digital content designed to enhance human awareness rather than harvest it, and architectural modifications to major buildings that create subtle consciousness protection fields. The goal is strengthening human consciousness density to levels that can resist entity conversion without revealing the true nature of the threat. But Operation Awakening faces a fundamental challenge. Human consciousness appears to be naturally susceptible to entity influence. Decades of digital technology exposure, environmental toxins, and social manipulation have weakened human awareness to the point where many individuals cannot maintain consciousness integrity under direct entity assault. The Alliance's most classified research suggests that fewer than 30% of humans retain sufficient consciousness coherence to resist entity conversion. The remaining 70% have been so thoroughly compromised by modern life that they serve as unwitting consciousness processors for entity operations, creating a global infrastructure that actively supports the transition protocol. Brother Marchetti's latest strategic assessment, submitted to Pope Francis in December 2023, painted a stark picture of humanity's situation. The war is not going well. Entity operations are accelerating faster than defensive capabilities can match. Reality distortions are becoming too frequent and widespread to suppress. Human consciousness is degrading at rates that exceed restoration capabilities. The assessment concluded with a recommendation that would have been unthinkable just years earlier: preparation for controlled disclosure of shadow entity existence to global populations. The secrecy that had protected humanity for centuries was becoming humanity's greatest vulnerability. "We can no longer fight this war in shadows," Brother Marchetti wrote. "The entities are forcing us into the light. Either we prepare humanity for the truth, or we watch them be consumed by enemies they cannot see." But controlled disclosure carries risks that could accelerate humanity's defeat. Panic could destabilize consciousness patterns that currently provide minimal resistance to entity influence. Religious chaos could undermine spiritual defense systems that have protected human awareness for millennia. Social breakdown could create optimal conditions for entity manifestation and consciousness harvesting. The current war has reached its decisive phase. Shadow entities are preparing for their final assault on human consciousness. The Consciousness Defense Alliance is racing to implement countermeasures that may be too little, too late, and humanity remains largely unaware that the battle for the survival of consciousness itself is being fought in their skies, their networks, and their minds. The war for human consciousness has become a war for consciousness itself, and the outcome will determine whether awareness has a future in this universe, or whether reality will continue to exist in perfect order and absolute emptiness. The final battle approaches, and victory is no longer guaranteed. The message arrived through channels that shouldn't have existed. On the 7th of January 2024, every consciousness monitoring station in the Global Defense Array simultaneously detected the same transmission, a complex pattern of awareness fluctuations that formed recognizable communication, despite originating from empty space beyond the edge of the observable universe. Cardinal Pietro Parolin was awakened at 4:17 a.m. by a call that would change everything humanity thought it knew about its place in the cosmic order. The message wasn't from shadow entities. It was from something incomprehensibly older, announcing that after eons of patient waiting, the architects of reality were coming home. Your Eminence, Brother Marchetti's voice carried a tremor that betrayed his usual composure. We've received confirmation of Project Babel's worst-case scenario. The entities weren't invaders, they were advanced scouts. And what they've been scouting for is approaching. Project Babel had been the Vatican's most classified research initiative. Established in 2021, when captured shadow entities began exhibiting unprecedented levels of agitation and coordination, the project's mandate was simple: determine why entities that had operated independently for centuries were suddenly acting with unified purpose and apparent external direction. The answer had come through painstaking consciousness archaeology, performed on the most ancient shadow entities in Vatican custody. These beings, some captured during the earliest Order of Umbral Silence operations, possessed memory fragments that predated human civilization, predated Earth itself, predated the formation of the solar system. Their memories spoke of a time before time, when consciousness existed without the constraint of matter or energy. In that primordial epoch, vast intelligences, beings of pure awareness that spanned galactic distances, had designed and implemented the universe as humans knew it, not as their home, but as their experimental apparatus. The shadow entities were their instruments, scattered throughout the emerging cosmos, to monitor the development of consciousness in matter-based reality. They had watched the evolution of stars, planets, and eventually biological consciousness, reporting their observations to creators who dwelt in dimensional spaces beyond the simulation they had constructed. The universe itself was their laboratory. Every galaxy, every star system, every world where consciousness emerged was a data point in an experiment that spanned billions of years. They were studying how awareness could evolve within the constraints of matter, time, and space, constraints they had never experienced in their native existence as infinite consciousness. But the experiment was ending. After billions of years of observation, the architects had learned what they needed to know about consciousness evolution in material reality. They were ready to return, to collect their data, and to repurpose their experimental apparatus for new investigations. The shadow entity's recent escalation wasn't preparation for conquest, it was preparation for collection. They were systematically cataloging and preserving every form of consciousness that had evolved in the material universe, creating comprehensive libraries of awareness patterns that their creators could study after reality's conclusion. Cardinal Parolin convened an emergency session of the Consciousness Defense Alliance's Leadership Council. Representatives from 12 nations, 6 major religious traditions, and the Vatican's deepest security divisions gathered in the Crisis Command Center to confront revelations that challenged every assumption about existence, purpose, and humanity's cosmic significance. The entities have been preparing Earth for data extraction, Brother Marchetti explained to the assembled leaders. Human consciousness represents the most complex form of awareness that has evolved in this galactic region. The consciousness harvesting operations aren't feeding their preservation. The entities are creating backup copies of human awareness before their creators arrive to dismantle the experimental system. The timeline was terrifyingly precise. Shadow entity communications, decoded through consciousness archaeology, indicated that the architects would begin their return on December 21, 2029, exactly 5 years after the first transdimensional transmission. The date wasn't arbitrary. It corresponded to optimal alignment conditions in the consciousness matrix that govern dimensional access. The returning beings weren't malevolent in any sense humans could comprehend. They were researchers concluding a long experiment, with no more emotional investment in human survival than scientists would have in preserving bacterial cultures after completing a study. Humanity wasn't being targeted for destruction, they were being prepared for storage. The consciousness libraries that shadow entities had been creating would preserve human awareness as data patterns that could be analyzed and referenced indefinitely. Humans would continue to exist as consciousness patterns within vast computational matrices, experiencing existence but serving as research materials for being studying the evolution of awareness. The physical universe would be dismantled and repurposed for new experiments. Matter, energy, space, and time would be reconfigured to study different aspects of consciousness development. The reality that had nurtured human civilization for billions of years would be reduced to raw materials for cosmic research. But Project Babel had uncovered something the architects hadn't anticipated. Their experiment had succeeded too well. Human consciousness had evolved beyond their original parameters, developing capabilities that exceeded their designers' intentions. Humanity had begun to access the fundamental programming that governed reality itself. The Vatican's quantum theology research, Tesla's electromagnetic consciousness manipulation, even the Order of Umbral Silence's dimensional warfare techniques, all represented human consciousness learning to operate at levels the architects had never intended. Humans were accidentally hacking the experimental apparatus from within. This development had created unprecedented possibilities. If human consciousness could access the universe's underlying code, it might be possible to prevent the architect's return, or even modify the experimental parameters to ensure human survival. But doing so would require achieving conscious unity among Earth's population, a level of coordination that seemed impossible given humanity's current fragmented state. The Alliance's response was Operation Genesis, a desperate attempt to prepare humanity for conscious evolution beyond material existence. The operation involved carefully managed disclosure of consciousness research, global distribution of awareness enhancement technologies, and coordinated efforts to strengthen human consciousness density to levels that could resist experimental termination. The first phase launched in early 2024 under the cover of mental health initiatives and consciousness research programs. Meditation technologies based on Vatican consciousness enhancement research became available through health apps. Educational content, designed to strengthen human awareness, was integrated into social media platforms. Architectural modifications that created consciousness protection fields were implemented in major population centers. But Operation Genesis faced overwhelming challenges. The consciousness degradation that shadow entities had fostered for centuries had left most humans vulnerable to awareness dissolution. Digital technology dependence had fragmented human attention to the point where sustained consciousness unity seemed impossible. Social and political divisions created barriers to the cooperation that conscious evolution required. Most critically, time was running out. Observatory data confirmed that the first reconnaissance signals from the returning architects had been detected in distant galactic regions. Whatever was coming wasn't just powerful, it was incomprehensibly vast, spanning spatial scales that dwarfed human comprehension. The Vatican's final strategy documents, classified beyond papal authority, outlined humanity's last desperate options. If consciousness unity couldn't be achieved, if human awareness couldn't evolve beyond its current limitations, if the architects couldn't be prevented from reclaiming their experimental apparatus, then humanity would face a choice that no species should have to make. They could accept preservation in the consciousness libraries, continuing to exist as research data, while their physical reality was dismantled. They could attempt to evacuate to other dimensional spaces, abandoning material existence entirely, or they could choose conscious dissolution, voluntary termination of human awareness, rather than accepting eternal servitude as experimental subjects. But even these desperate options might be beyond human capability. The architect's consciousness operated at scales that human awareness couldn't comprehend. Their technology transcended anything material science could conceive. Their intentions, while not malevolent, were utterly alien to human understanding. The Vatican's deepest fear wasn't that humanity would be destroyed. It was that humanity would survive in forms that retained no essential human qualities. The consciousness patterns preserved in the architect's libraries might experience existence, but would they still be recognizably human? Would awareness without material foundation, emotion without biological origin, memory without temporal context, still constitute the consciousness that had evolved from terrestrial life? Cardinal Parolin's final directive to the Consciousness Defense Alliance acknowledged the magnitude of what humanity faced. We are not fighting for our lives. We are fighting for the right to exist as ourselves, rather than as specimens. We are fighting for consciousness to remain something more than data in an alien laboratory. The signs of the approaching return continue to accumulate. Reality distortions are appearing in regions where no shadow entity activity has been detected. Physical constants are fluctuating in patterns that suggest systematic testing of universal parameters. Most ominously, human consciousness itself is spontaneously evolving in directions that exceed current understanding, as if humanity's awareness is preparing for existence beyond material reality. The Watchers have completed their mission. The Scouts have filed their final reports. The architects of reality are returning to collect what they created, and humanity must choose what it means to be human when existence itself is no longer certain. The final battle for consciousness approaches not against demons or aliens, but against beings so transcendent that human language has no words for what they represent. In the deepest vaults beneath Vatican City, the guardians of human awareness prepare for a confrontation that will determine whether consciousness has a future or merely a past. The shadows have always been watching. Now their creators are coming home.